Here is something that nobody tells you when you spend your evenings trying to fall asleep and failing. The way you sleep, the assumption that you should get into bed at some reasonable hour, stay unconscious for approximately 8 hours, and wake up when it's light, is not how human beings naturally sleep. It is not how human beings slept for most of human history. And it is most emphatically not how people slept in the medieval period, which is what we are going to be talking about for the next 2.5 hours. The medieval approach to sleep was, by modern standards, extraordinarily weird. Not weird in the sense of wrong. In many ways, it was better aligned with human biology than what we currently do. But weird in the sense of completely different from everything you have been taught to expect from a night's sleep. The timing was different. The structure was different. The location was different. The social arrangements were different. The relationship to darkness, to noise, to other people, to the concept of privacy, all completely different. If you could somehow be transported back to a medieval English village in, say, the year 1200, and you tried to sleep the way you currently sleep, alone in a private room, uninterrupted from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. in silence and darkness, you would be considered profoundly strange by everyone around you. The combination of being alone, being in the dark by choice, and sleeping in a single unbroken block would have seemed not just unusual but vaguely suspicious. Because in the medieval world, people did not sleep that way. They slept in 2 separate sessions with a wakeful period in the middle. They slept in groups, often with people they barely knew. They slept in rooms that were simultaneously bedrooms, living rooms, and sometimes working rooms, alongside animals, children, servants, and guests. They slept according to the rhythms of the church bells, the seasons, and the movements of livestock. And they had a relationship with the act of sleep, with its purposes, its dangers, its proper conduct, and its spiritual significance. That was entirely unlike anything most of us have thought about. This is one of those historical topics that starts out sounding like a curiosity and ends up being genuinely illuminating about the human condition. Because when you look at medieval sleep practices, really look at them, with the attention they deserve, you start to realize that a lot of what modern people think of as universal human experiences of sleep are actually specific cultural constructions from a particular historical moment. The 8-hour block is not natural. The private bedroom is not natural. The idea that lying awake in the middle of the night means something is wrong with you is not natural. Medieval people knew all of this because they had never been told otherwise. Their sleep was, in many ways, more honest, more aligned with the actual rhythms of the human body than what we currently do. So if you are lying here right now, listening to this at midnight, having woken up from your first period of sleep and now unable to get back to the second, congratulations. You are experiencing what your ancestors would have considered completely normal. You are, biologically speaking, doing it right. Let's talk about what medieval sleep actually looked like. All of it. Every detail. Because this is a topic that deserves to be explored properly, and we have 2.5 hours to do it in. The single most important fact about medieval sleep, the one that completely upends the modern understanding of what sleep is supposed to be, is this: medieval people did not sleep in a single unbroken block. They slept in 2 separate periods, with a wakeful interval in between, and this was considered completely normal. Expected. Biologically appropriate. The natural way that human beings sleep. This is called segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, and the evidence for it in the medieval period is overwhelming. Medieval texts refer to first sleep and second sleep as distinct and well-understood concepts. In Middle English, the first sleep was called first slep, and the second was called morwen slep, morning sleep. French texts distinguish premier sommeil from second sommeil. Latin texts make the same distinction. The terminology appears so casually and so frequently in medieval documents that it is clearly describing something that everyone understood without needing explanation. The timing varied by season because medieval sleep was organized around darkness, not clocks, but the general pattern was something like this. You went asleep when it got dark or shortly after dark. You slept for roughly 4 hours. Then you woke up, naturally and without alarm, sometime around midnight. You spent an hour or two awake. Then you went back to sleep for another 4 hours, waking up around dawn. The wakeful period in the middle was not considered insomnia. It was not considered a problem. It was a recognized and expected part of the night, with its own activities and social functions. Medieval people used this time for prayer. The canonical hours of the church included an office called matins, designed for the watches of the night. They used it for sex. Medieval medical literature specifically recommended the interval between sleeps as the optimal time for conception. Because the body was rested but not yet fully slept, the mind was calm but alert, and according to medieval reproductive theory, the conditions were right for generating healthy children. They also used it for conversation, for quiet domestic tasks, for visiting neighbors if they lived in close enough proximity, and if records of medieval crime are any guide, for the occasional act of minor mischief that was better conducted when most people were in their first sleep. The historian Roger Eckhart, who did the foundational research on this topic in his 2001 paper and subsequent book, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, identified hundreds of references to segmented sleep in medieval and early modern texts from across Europe. The references are so consistent across such a wide range of sources: medical texts, literary works, court records, personal diaries, religious manuals, that it is essentially impossible to doubt that this was the genuine norm for most of European history. What changed? The short answer is artificial light. The long answer is the Industrial Revolution and the urban transformation of European life that came with it. When cities developed gas lighting in the early 19th century, and then electric lighting later, the rigid boundary between day and night began to dissolve. Work hours extended into the evening. Social activities extended into the night. The pressure to be active, productive, and awake was no longer limited by darkness. And somewhere in this process, the two-sleep pattern, which depended on going to sleep when it got dark, was gradually replaced by the single-block sleep we now consider normal. The consequence, which Eckhart and subsequent sleep researchers have argued, is that modern sleep disorders, particularly the experience of waking in the middle of the night and being unable to sleep, may in significant part be the result of a mismatch between our biological sleep architecture and the social norms we have constructed around sleep. Our bodies want to sleep in 2 periods. Modern society wants us to sleep in 1. The tension between these 2 things is real, measurable, and probably responsible for a significant amount of what we now call insomnia. Medieval people did not have insomnia in the modern sense, for the simple reason that they did not have the expectation of a single unbroken sleep that insomnia is defined as failing to achieve. They woke up at midnight, spent some time awake, and went back to sleep. That was the design. It worked, and we could perhaps stand to learn something from it. The medieval bed, for most of the medieval population, was not a comfortable private sanctuary. It was a shared piece of furniture in a shared space, frequently occupied by multiple people simultaneously, and located in a room that served many purposes other than sleep. Understanding where medieval people slept requires abandoning almost everything the modern world has taught us to expect about the relationship between sleep and space. Let us start at the top of the social hierarchy and work our way down, because the experience varied enormously depending on where you sat in medieval society. For the wealthy lords, bishops, successful merchants, the higher nobility, the bed itself was an extraordinarily significant piece of furniture. A great lord's bed was typically massive, a wooden frame with a canopy and curtains, large enough to sleep multiple people, with a mattress stuffed with wool or down feathers, covered with linen sheets and wool blankets, and surrounded by hangings that could be drawn to create a space of relative privacy and warmth. This bed was not hidden in a private chamber. It was a statement of status, displayed proudly in the Lord's principal chamber, which was simultaneously his bedroom, his receiving room, and the space where important business was conducted. Guests of appropriate status might sleep in this same chamber, on smaller beds or pallets arranged around the Lord's great bed. Servants slept in the outer rooms or on the floor of the hall. The hierarchy of sleeping arrangements in a great medieval household was an exact mirror of the social hierarchy. The more important you were, the closer you slept to the center of the household. The concept of a bedroom as a private space, used exclusively for sleep by a single person or couple, was largely non-existent for most of the medieval period. The Lord's chamber was private only in the sense that access to it was restricted by rank. You could not enter without appropriate status or invitation. But within that restricted space, it was typically occupied by multiple people. For the middle ranks of medieval society, the yeoman farmer, the urban craftsman, the minor clergyman, sleeping arrangements were considerably more communal. The typical house of a middling medieval family consisted of 1 or 2 rooms that served all domestic purposes simultaneously. The sleeping space was also the living space, the cooking space, and often the working space. Everyone who lived in the house slept in the same room. This typically included the married couple, their children of all ages, any servants or apprentices, and quite possibly elderly relatives or lodgers. The beds available to this class ranged from a wooden frame with a straw mattress, considerably more comfortable than it sounds if the straw was fresh, to a simple pallet or straw bag on the floor. Multiple people shared a single bed, without this being considered unusual or inappropriate. Sharing a bed with people outside your immediate family, guests, travelers, business acquaintances, was normal. Medieval inns routinely put strangers in the same bed, and travelers accepted this as a matter of course. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, the landless laborer, the truly destitute, sleeping arrangements were whatever could be arranged. A pile of straw in a barn, a corner of a communal sleeping hall, the floor near someone else's fire, if they would allow it. The relationship between poverty and cold in the medieval world was intimate and deadly, and for people at the very bottom, sleep and survival were closely related concerns. Staying warm enough to sleep and staying warm enough to stay alive were the same problem. The communal bed deserves its own section, because it represents such a fundamental departure from modern expectations about sleep that it requires careful attention to understand properly. In the modern world, sharing a bed with a stranger is an unusual and typically uncomfortable situation that we go to some lengths to avoid. We book private rooms at hotels. We are disturbed by the idea of physical proximity to someone we do not know in a context as intimate as sleep. The bed is understood as a private space, associated with our most vulnerable and personal moments. Medieval people did not have this feeling. Or rather, if they did have it, they did not have the luxury of acting on it. The communal bed was a simple practical reality for most of the medieval world, and it was accepted with a matter-of-factness that the modern traveler would find astonishing. The evidence for the normality of bed sharing in the medieval period comes from a wide range of sources. Medieval hospitality literature advises hosts on the proper way to arrange shared sleeping quarters for guests. Medieval etiquette manuals include guidance on how to behave when sharing a bed. Do not take more than your fair share of the blankets. Do not disturb your bedfellow unnecessarily. Do not fidget excessively. The very existence of this etiquette guidance confirms that sharing beds with people outside the immediate family was common enough to require a code of conduct. Medieval law codes, when dealing with crimes that occurred at night, routinely include provisions for situations where a crime was committed by someone sharing a bed with the victim, which implies that this was a common enough arrangement to produce legal edge cases. Court records from the medieval period are full of testimony that references bed-sharing arrangements between people of various relationships: friends, business partners, master and servant, traveler and innkeeper, and occasionally complete strangers who happen to arrive at the same inn on the same night. The gender dynamics of medieval bed sharing were also different from what a modern reader might expect. While the mixing of male and female strangers in a single bed was generally frowned upon, and was specifically prohibited in some monastic and ecclesiastical contexts, the sharing of beds by men or by women was unremarkable. Male travelers shared beds with male strangers. Female travelers shared beds with female strangers. Servants of the same gender shared beds as a matter of course. This was not considered intimate or unusual, it was simply practical. The temperature explanation is important and is often overlooked. Medieval houses were cold. The heating technology available, a central hearth, possibly a fireplace, was inefficient by modern standards, and the insulation provided by medieval walls was minimal. In the winter months especially, sharing body heat was a significant survival consideration. A bed shared with 2 or 3 other warm bodies was meaningfully warmer than a bed occupied alone, and in the coldest winters of the medieval period, and there were some very cold winters, this difference was not trivial. The psychological dimension is also worth considering. Medieval culture did not place the same value on individual privacy that modern Western culture does. The self was understood as fundamentally embedded in a social context, in a family, a village, a guild, a parish, a lord's household, and the idea of seeking solitude as a positive experience was primarily associated with religious practice rather than ordinary life. A monk sought solitude as a discipline, to focus on God. An ordinary person seeking solitude would have seemed antisocial, possibly suspicious. Sleep in this context was a social act rather than a private one. You slept with the people you lived with, worked with, or traveled with in the same way that you ate with them, prayed with them, and worked with them. The separation of sleep from the social world, its sequestration into a private bedroom, experienced alone or with only a partner, is a relatively recent development in the long history of human sleep. If the communal bed with strangers is surprising, the next feature of medieval sleeping arrangements may be even more so: animals. In the typical medieval peasant household, the sleeping space was shared not just with other human beings, but with the livestock that the family depended on for survival. This was not an unusual arrangement born of desperation. It was standard practice, well documented across medieval Europe, and it made a great deal of practical sense in the context of medieval life. Livestock, particularly cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, represented an enormous proportion of a peasant family's wealth. Letting them spend the night outside, exposed to theft, predators, and the cold, was not an acceptable risk. Keeping them inside in the same space where the family slept was the logical solution. The standard solution in much of medieval northern Europe was the longhouse, a building design in which the human living quarters and the animal quarters were under the same roof, separated by a partition or simply by the arrangement of the space. In the better designed versions, the animals were at the lower end of the building, since medieval longhouses were often built on a slight slope, and the humans at the upper end, so that the drainage from the animal area did not flow toward the human area. In practice, this separation was imperfect, and the cohabitation was considerably more intimate than any modern person would find comfortable. The benefits of this arrangement were real. The body heat generated by a stable of cattle is substantial. The fermentation of the animal's digestive processes produces considerable warmth. And in a poorly heated medieval house, this ambient heat from the animal end of the building made a measurable difference to the sleeping temperature in the human end. This was understood and appreciated by medieval people, who were not squeamish about the practical realities of animal-human cohabitation in the way that modern sensibilities require. The noise implications were significant. If you have ever spent a night in close proximity to sleeping cattle, pigs, or sheep, you are aware that these animals are not silent. They breathe noisily. They shift position. They occasionally vocalize. They produce sounds and smells that are not conducive to the modern conception of a peaceful sleeping environment. Medieval people who grew up in this environment were presumably accustomed to it, habituated to the ambient noise and smell of shared space, with animals in the same way that modern city dwellers become habituated to traffic noise. The children who grew up sleeping a few feet from the family cow simply did not find it disturbing, because they had never slept any other way. Dogs were an even more intimate presence than larger livestock. The medieval dog occupied a social position that was considerably less sentimental than the modern pet. Dogs were working animals, expected to earn their keep through guarding, herding, or hunting. But they were also genuinely valued and spent considerable time in close physical proximity to their owners. Dogs sleeping in or near the human sleeping space was universal across all social classes, and was mentioned so frequently in medieval sources that it barely registered as noteworthy. Cats were present for practical rodent control, and while they appear less frequently in the sleep-related literature than dogs, their presence in medieval sleeping spaces was common enough. The rat and mouse problem in medieval grain-storing households was serious, and the cat's contribution to solving it was genuinely appreciated. The overall picture of the medieval sleeping space is one that would strike any modern person as dramatically, almost incomprehensibly different from their own experience. Multiple humans in close physical proximity. Body heat deliberately shared. Animals present and accepted. Noise and smell that would be considered intolerable in a modern context, simply accepted as the texture of life. The separateness and quietness and privacy that modern sleep assumes were entirely absent, and their absence was not experienced as a deprivation. They simply were not part of what sleep meant. Let us talk about the physical technology of medieval sleep, the actual beds and bedding that people used, because it ranged from genuinely comfortable to essentially nothing, and the range illuminates both the material conditions of medieval life and the priorities that medieval people had around sleep. The great medieval bed, as described earlier, was an elaborate piece of furniture. For the upper reaches of society, a bed was one of the most valuable objects they owned. Medieval wills frequently include specific bequests of beds and bedding, indicating that these were items of significant monetary and sentimental value. A great lord's bed might have a carved and painted wooden frame, a canopy supported on posts, curtains of expensive fabric that could be drawn to provide warmth and a degree of privacy, and a mattress stuffed with feathers or fine wool. This mattress would sit on a rope or leather base stretched across the frame, the medieval version of a box spring, which provided some give and prevented the sleeper from lying directly on wood. The curtains around the great bed served a function that modern people rarely think about. They trapped body heat. A heavily curtained medieval bed was a miniature warm space within a cold room. Drawing the curtains before sleep was the medieval equivalent of turning up the thermostat. It also provided acoustic separation, not silence, but a reduction in the ambient noise of a room full of servants and guests, and visual privacy in a space where privacy was otherwise limited. The mattress materials available in the medieval period varied significantly by social class. Feathers, goose down in particular, were luxurious and expensive, reserved for the wealthy. Wool was more accessible, though still a significant expense. The most common mattress filling for ordinary people was straw or rushes, which was practical, cheap, and replaceable when it became infested or simply too compacted to provide any cushioning. A fresh straw mattress was considerably more comfortable than it might sound. Straw is actually a reasonably good insulator and has some give, but a straw mattress that had been in use for months and had accumulated the inevitable biological residue of medieval sleeping was not. Linen sheets, when available, were a significant comfort. Linen has excellent temperature-regulating properties, is durable enough to survive regular washing, and is considerably more comfortable next to skin than wool. For the wealthy, multiple layers of linen sheets were available and appreciated. For the poor, a single sheet, if they had one at all, was the norm. Many of the very poor slept without any sheet at all, on or under whatever rough fabric could be found. Blankets and coverlets ranged from fine wool, or even fur for the wealthy, to rough homespun woolen fabric for the ordinary. In a cold medieval winter, the question of how many blankets were available was a genuinely important one, not a matter of comfort, but of survival. The documentation of blankets and bed coverings in medieval wills, estate inventories, and legal records reflects the real material value that these items had for people who depended on them to stay warm enough to sleep safely. The pillow, when it existed, was often a simple fabric bag stuffed with the same materials as the mattress, or sometimes with dried herbs chosen for their scent or supposed soporific properties. The use of multiple pillows, in the modern fashion of propping oneself up against a stack, was not universal. Medieval medical advice on sleeping position, which we will discuss, sometimes recommended specific postures that may or may not have involved pillows. For the very bottom of medieval society, the concept of a bed in any of these forms was simply not available. A straw pallet on the floor, a rough ticking bag filled with straw, was the minimum. Below that was simply the floor, with whatever fabric could be piled on top. Medieval hospitals, which existed primarily as religious institutions for the care of the poor and sick, often had communal sleeping arrangements with multiple patients sharing a single bed, not because this was considered ideal, but because it was the minimum that could be provided with the resources available. To understand medieval sleep properly, you have to understand medieval darkness. Not the dimness of a modern bedroom with the curtains drawn, not the relative darkness of a rural area before dawn, genuine, profound, disorienting darkness of a kind that almost no one in the modern world has experienced, and that most of us cannot fully imagine. In the medieval world, when the sun went down and the fire in the hearth burned low, the darkness was complete. The moon provided significant ambient light when it was full and the sky was clear, but on a cloudy night or a new moon, the darkness indoors was absolute. Even outdoors, on a cloudy medieval night, the darkness was of a quality that the modern urban or suburban dweller simply cannot experience. This darkness shaped everything about medieval sleep. It determined when sleep began. People went to bed when they could no longer usefully see to work, because candles and oil lamps were expensive commodities that were not used casually. It determined when sleep ended. People woke with the light, because there was nothing to do in the dark that required sustained visual attention. And it shaped the psychological texture of the night in ways that had profound effects on how medieval people thought about and experienced their sleeping hours. The darkness of the medieval night was populated, in the medieval imagination, with genuine threats. Not just the thieves and criminals who operated more effectively in the dark than in the day, though those were real but supernatural threats that were, within the medieval belief system, equally real. The night belonged to demons, to the restless dead, to spirits of various kinds that the light of day kept at bay. Medieval theological and folk traditions were in complete agreement that darkness was the natural habitat of malevolent supernatural forces, and this was not considered superstition. It was considered straightforward cosmological fact. This had practical effects on medieval sleep behavior. People slept with certain protective measures, prayers, religious objects, specific postures that were intended to ward off the spiritual dangers of the night. Churches encouraged specific bedtime prayers for this purpose. Amulets and protective charms were common. The sign of the cross before sleeping was a universal practice. And the presence of other people in the sleeping space was not just a practical comfort, but a spiritual one. There was a sense that the malevolent forces of the night were more likely to attack the isolated sleeper than the group. The darkness also explains a great deal about the wakeful period between first and second sleep. If you woke at midnight in a medieval house in total darkness, you were not going to read. You were not going to do needlework. You were not going to write a letter. The activities available to you in the dark were limited to those that did not require light. Prayer, which could be done from memory, quiet conversation, sex, and lying in contemplation of whatever the medieval mind contemplated in the dark hours of the night, which, from the surviving records, appears to have included a great deal of religious reflection, worry about practical matters, and the interpretation of dreams. The relationship between darkness and fear in the medieval period is important to understand correctly. It would be easy to caricature medieval people as simply terrified of the dark in a childish way. The reality is more nuanced. Medieval people had a sophisticated theological framework for understanding the night and its dangers, and within that framework, specific protective practices that they genuinely believed were effective. The fear was real, but so was the protective response, and the result was not paralysis, but a set of rituals and arrangements that allowed people to navigate the dangerous night with a degree of confidence. What they did not do was simply ignore the night or treat it as equivalent to the day. The night was different. It required different behavior, different precautions, and a different orientation of mind. And this differentness shaped their sleep in ways that are completely absent from modern sleep, which takes place in climate-controlled darkness that can be instantly dispelled by a light switch. If you slept in medieval Europe, you slept within earshot of church bells. This was not accidental. The church bell was the primary technology of public timekeeping in the medieval world, and the organization of the night, including the organization of sleep, was structured around the canonical hours that the bells marked. The canonical hours, the 8 daily prayer times prescribed by the Catholic Church, divided the day and night into marked segments. Matins at midnight or shortly after. Lauds just before dawn. Prime at sunrise. Terce mid-morning. Sext noon. None mid-afternoon. Vespers evening. Compline before bed. These hours were announced by church bells, and in a medieval community, the bells were audible over a substantial distance. You knew what time it was, or approximately what time it was, by listening to the bells. For the monastic community, the canonical hours were the absolute organizing principle of daily life, including sleep. Monks went to bed after Compline and rose for matins at midnight, precisely the structure of first sleep that we described earlier. The monastic daily schedule was not a spiritual invention, but a codification of the natural human sleep pattern, and it worked because it aligned with biology rather than fighting it. For the lay population, the bells provided temporal orientation without requiring strict compliance. You did not have to get up for matins if you were a peasant with livestock to tend and fields to work, but you heard the bells, you knew it was midnight, and if you were awake in your natural intersleep interval, the sound of the matins bell confirmed that you were right on time. The bells and the sleep pattern reinforced each other. The sound of church bells in the medieval night was therefore not an intrusion on sleep, but a structuring element of it. The bells told you when to sleep, when to wake, and when to sleep again. They were not an alarm. They did not wake you if you were sleeping through your first sleep at 9 p.m. But they marked the time in a way that oriented you within the night, and the wakeful period that began naturally around midnight was confirmed and given meaning by the matins bell. The absence of this kind of public temporal marking is one of the more significant differences between medieval sleep and modern sleep. We sleep or try to sleep in a temporal structure organized by clocks, work schedules, and electronic devices. The church bell as a technology of time has been replaced by the alarm clock, but the alarm clock is fundamentally different. It is designed to interrupt sleep at a specified time, not to mark the natural rhythms of the night. Medieval people slept with the bells as a background confirmation of a natural pattern. Modern people sleep against the alarm clock's artificial imposition of a different pattern. The question of what people wore to sleep in the medieval period is one of those topics that sounds trivial, but actually illuminates a great deal about medieval attitudes toward the body, privacy, and the social organization of sleeping space. The short answer: It varied enormously by social class and context, and the modern concept of specific sleepwear, designed exclusively for sleeping in, was largely absent for most of the medieval period. For most ordinary medieval people, sleep clothing was simply the underclothing that they wore during the day, a linen shift or chemise for women, a linen shirt for men, with the heavier outer garments removed. This was not a special garment worn exclusively at night. It was simply the innermost layer of daily dress, which happened to be comfortable enough to sleep in. The idea of having a separate garment designated specifically for nighttime wear was, for most of the medieval period, a luxury that only the wealthy could afford to think about. For the wealthy, dedicated nightgowns and nightshirts did exist and are documented in the sources. These were typically made of fine linen, and they could be elaborate and expensive garments. Medieval household inventories sometimes list nightgowns specifically, distinguishing them from day garments, which indicates that they were sufficiently distinct and valuable to be worth noting separately. At the other end of the spectrum, and this is documented in contemporary sources, there were people who slept entirely naked. This was more common in summer, particularly among people sleeping in warm spaces, and it was not considered scandalous in the context of communal sleeping arrangements, where everyone present was accustomed to seeing each other in various states of undress. The medieval relationship to bodily privacy was different from the modern one, particularly in contexts where physical proximity was a practical necessity. The head covering deserves specific mention. Medieval medical opinion held that the head should be kept warm during sleep, partly because of theories about the relationship between cold and illness, and partly because medieval houses were cold enough that an uncovered head in a poorly heated room genuinely resulted in discomfort. Nightcaps, fabric caps worn to sleep in, were a standard item of sleepwear across a wide range of social classes, and they appear frequently in medieval illustrations and documentary sources. The image of the medieval person asleep in a nightcap is not a comic exaggeration. It is an accurate representation of a genuinely common practice. Feet were another temperature concern. Medieval people sleeping in cold rooms frequently slept in their stockings, the woolen leg coverings that were a standard part of medieval dress, even after removing other garments. Cold feet in the medieval context were not just uncomfortable. In the coldest conditions, they could be dangerous. Medieval physicians had strong and specific views about how you should sleep, and these views were backed by the most sophisticated medical theory available at the time, which meant they were backed by a blend of Greek medical inheritance, Arabic medical commentary, and practical observation that produced some recommendations that are surprisingly sensible and some that are considerably less so. The theoretical framework was humoral medicine, the system inherited from Hippocrates and Galen that understood health as a balance of four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Different sleeping positions were believed to affect the flow and balance of these humors, and medieval physicians recommended specific positions to maintain health and avoid disease. Sleeping on the right side was widely recommended in medieval medical literature. The reasoning within the humoral framework was that lying on the right side allowed the liver, which was believed to be the principal organ of digestion, to warm the stomach properly, promoting healthy digestion during sleep. Since digestion was understood as a process that continued during sleep, and since proper digestion was considered essential to overall health, facilitating it by correct sleeping position made logical sense within the theoretical framework. Sleeping on the left side was generally discouraged, though the degree of discouragement varied by source. Sleeping on the back, supine sleep, was widely considered problematic, though the specific reasons given vary. Some sources suggest it allows vapors from the digestive process to rise to the brain, causing unpleasant or dangerous dreams. Others suggest it makes the sleeper more vulnerable to supernatural attack from above, a concern that reflects the cosmological beliefs about the night that we discussed earlier. Sleeping on the stomach, prone sleep, was also generally deprecated by medieval medical sources. The reasons given again vary. but several sources suggest it compresses the digestive organs in unhealthy ways and interferes with the proper processing of food consumed during the day. The overall picture is of a medical tradition that had thought carefully about sleep position and arrived at a recommendation of right-side sleeping that is not entirely contradicted by modern sleep science. Current sleep medicine actually does suggest that certain sleeping positions can affect health outcomes, though the mechanism is different from what medieval physicians imagined. Medieval physicians also had recommendations about timing, specifically about not sleeping immediately after eating. The reasoning, again within the humoral framework, was that the body needed to begin the digestive process before sleep could safely be undertaken. Lying down immediately after a meal was believed to interfere with this process in ways that could produce illness. The medieval physicians' advice about waiting before sleeping after a heavy meal is not significantly different from what modern nutritionists might suggest, even if the theoretical explanation differs. Medieval dreams were not just experiences to be remembered or forgotten. They were messages from God, from angels, from saints, from demons, from the physical condition of the dreamer's body, or from the universal patterns of fate. And they were taken with a seriousness that the modern world, which tends to regard dreams as neurological noise, has largely lost. The medieval theology of dreams was sophisticated and multifaceted. The church had to navigate a tension between the scriptural tradition, which included numerous prophetic dreams, from Joseph's dreams in Genesis to the visions of the prophets, and the danger of treating dreams as reliable guides to action, which could lead to credulity, self-deception, or susceptibility to demonic manipulation. The standard medieval theological framework for understanding dreams distinguished between several categories. True dreams sent by God or angels carried genuine prophetic content and were to be heeded. False dreams sent by demons mimicked true dreams but were designed to mislead. Somatic dreams arose from the physical condition of the body, from indigestion, illness, or humoral imbalance, and carried no supernatural content but might indicate something about the dreamer's health. Natural dreams arose from the preoccupations of the waking mind and reflected ordinary concerns rather than any supernatural communication. The challenge, of course, was that there was no reliable way to determine which category a given dream belonged to. The medieval solution was caution and consultation. Dreams that seemed important were discussed with confessors, spiritual directors, or physicians, depending on their apparent nature. Recurrent dreams were particularly attended to, as were dreams that came in the early morning, which were considered more likely to be prophetic than dreams of the first sleep, on the grounds that the body was cleaner and the mind calmer in the second sleep. Dream interpretation manuals, somniaria or dream books, were a popular genre of medieval literature. These texts provided systematic interpretation guides for common dream images, often organized alphabetically by the thing seen in the dream. If you dreamed of a horse, the book would tell you what that meant. If you dreamed of water, of fire, of a particular person or animal, the book would offer an interpretation. These texts were read seriously, not as entertainment, and the dream interpretation literature was one of the more widely distributed types of text in the medieval world. The practical effect of this dream theology on medieval sleep was significant. When you woke in the middle of the night in the natural intersleep interval, you were likely to spend some of that time in conscious reflection on the dreams of your first sleep. This was not idle rumination. It was a serious spiritual activity, potentially revealing important information about your future, your health, or the state of your soul. The wakeful period was, in part, a period of dream processing in a tradition that took dreams seriously as meaningful experiences. The relationship between the two-sleep structure and dream processing may be relevant here. Research in modern sleep science has identified the period of waking between sleep stages as a natural period of memory consolidation and processing. Medieval people, waking in the middle of the night as a matter of course, had a built-in period of conscious reflection that allowed them to engage with the content of their dreams in a deliberate way. The tradition of recording dreams upon waking, which appears in various forms in medieval religious and aristocratic practice, is not so different from what modern psychotherapists recommend when working with clients' dreams. Not everyone in the medieval world slept at night. The night watch, the men who patrolled streets and walls while the rest of the population slept, was a ubiquitous institution in medieval towns and cities, as important to urban safety as any military or judicial function. The medieval town at night was genuinely dangerous in ways that a modern town is not. The darkness was much more complete. The criminal element could operate with much greater anonymity. Fire, the most catastrophic risk to a medieval town built largely of wood and thatch, could spread from a single source to consume an entire neighborhood before anyone was awake to fight it. And the general absence of any public authority once the town gates closed meant that the night watch was the only organized presence standing between sleeping citizens and whatever the darkness brought. The night watchmen of medieval towns were typically local men required to serve by rotation, a civic obligation rather than a permanent paid position, though larger towns did employ professional watchmen. Their duties included patrolling designated routes, calling out the hours, which is where the tradition of the watchman calling "all's well" comes from, checking that gates and doors were properly secured, responding to alarms, and generally maintaining order during the hours when the population was asleep. The night watch's calling of the hours is directly relevant to our earlier discussion of the two-sleep structure. In a medieval town, the watchman calling out the midnight hour was not merely providing information. He was providing temporal orientation for the entire population. Everyone who was in their natural intersleep interval, lying awake in the dark after their first sleep, would hear the watchman call midnight and know exactly where they were in the night. The public announcement of time was a service to sleeping citizens as much as to the awake ones. The watch also served as a kind of community noise monitoring. A medieval town at 2 in the morning was supposed to be quiet. Noise at that hour was inherently suspicious. It indicated either a crime in progress, a fire starting, or some kind of civil disturbance that needed attention. The watchman's trained ear, listening to the ambient sounds of the sleeping town, could detect anomalies that the sleeping population could not. The experience of being a night watchman in the medieval period was, by most accounts, deeply unpleasant. The work was done in all weather, in complete darkness interrupted only by the watchman's own lantern, in a town that was psychologically transformed by the departure of the daylight population. Even within the rationalized framework of medieval theology, the night was still the night, still the time of demons, of danger, of things that moved in darkness. The night watchman was a brave man, or a man with few alternatives, or both. Medieval people were not exempt from sleep disorders. Insomnia, or what medieval medicine recognized as pathological wakefulness, appears in the medical literature, the religious literature, and the literary record with sufficient frequency to establish that difficulty sleeping was a recognized problem in the medieval world. The medieval understanding of insomnia was rooted in humoral theory. Sleeplessness was typically understood as a consequence of humoral imbalance, specifically of an excess of hot, dry humors that kept the brain in a state of agitation rather than the cool, moist state that was believed to be necessary for sleep. This framework was different from modern neuroscience, but it was not entirely wrong in its observations. The connection between states of mental agitation and difficulty sleeping is well established in modern sleep medicine, even if the mechanism is understood differently. Medieval remedies for insomnia were a mixture of dietary advice, herbal medicine, and practical behavioral recommendations that range from sensible to eccentric. Dietary recommendations typically involved avoiding hot and stimulating foods in the evening, spiced wine, heavily peppered meats, and favoring cooler, moister foods that would promote the humoral balance appropriate to sleep. This is not entirely different from what modern sleep hygiene advice recommends regarding stimulants and heavy meals before bed. Herbal remedies were extensive. Lettuce, which contains a mildly soporific compound called lactucarium in its sap, was widely recommended both to eat and to apply as a compress to the temples. Poppy, opium poppy, was known and used in various preparations, usually in small doses intended as mild sedatives rather than analgesics. Mandrake root had a strong reputation as a sleep inducer and appeared in various preparations, though it is both toxic in significant quantities and the subject of considerable folkloric elaboration that makes it difficult to assess its actual medical use. Valerian, which is still marketed as a sleep aid today, appears in medieval herbal texts as a remedy for sleeplessness. The religious dimension of insomnia was also addressed. If medical remedies failed, the sleepless person might be directed to prayer. Specific prayers for sleep were available and commonly used, or might be advised to consult a confessor about whether their sleeplessness might have a spiritual cause. The idea that unresolved sin, excessive anxiety about worldly matters, or insufficient trust in God's providence might produce sleeplessness was present in the theological literature, and the sleepless person who had exhausted medical options might reasonably turn to spiritual ones. Physical recommendations included specific sleeping positions, as discussed above, cooling the room, ensuring adequate ventilation, and the rubbing of the temples or the soles of the feet with soporific preparations. Some texts recommend reading or having someone else read aloud as a preparation for sleep, an insight that the creators of audiobooks and sleep podcasts have independently rediscovered. The medieval inn was one of the primary social institutions of the medieval world, and its sleeping arrangements deserve their own exploration because they illustrate, in concentrated form, many of the themes we have been discussing. Traveling in the medieval period was slow, physically demanding, and required overnight accommodation at regular intervals. The infrastructure for this accommodation, inns, guest houses, religious houses with a duty of hospitality, and private homes willing to take in travelers, was extensive but variable in quality, availability, and comfort. The typical medieval inn did not offer private rooms. It offered beds or spaces in beds, which were sold individually. A traveler arriving at a medieval inn would be assigned to a bed, and if that bed was already occupied, they would join whoever was already in it. This was the expected and normal arrangement, and it was accepted by travelers of all social classes, though the wealthy could sometimes arrange for more privacy by paying for exclusive use of a room. The bedding at a medieval inn was a matter of some complaint in contemporary sources. Inn mattresses, by the very nature of their use, were subjected to considerable wear and a wide variety of occupants, and the freshness of the straw filling was not always what it might have been. The blankets were shared across multiple guests, and were not always laundered as frequently as the sensitive traveler might wish. Fleas and lice were universal companions in medieval sleeping spaces, and inns, where many people passed through, were particularly notable repositories of these unwanted guests. Medieval inngoers were aware of these problems, and various strategies were used to manage them. Laying one's own cloak over the inn's bedding was a common practice. Traveling with one's own sheet was recommended by some practical manuals of travel. Specific inns developed reputations for cleanliness or the lack thereof, and experienced travelers sought out establishments known for better standards. The social mixing that occurred in medieval inns was one of the more remarkable features of medieval life. At the inn, the boundaries of the feudal hierarchy were partially suspended. A merchant might find himself sharing a bed with a minor knight. A pilgrim might sleep next to a soldier. The universal vulnerability of the sleeping state, in which everyone was equally horizontal, equally helpless, equally dependent on the good behavior of their bedfellows, created a kind of enforced equality that was unusual in a society otherwise organized around strict hierarchical distinctions. The rules of behavior in this intimate shared context were therefore important. Medieval etiquette literature that touches on in behavior emphasizes consideration for fellow sleepers. Do not make excessive noise, do not take more than your share of the blanket, do not bring lighted candles near the bedding, fire risk, and do not disturb others with excessive moving around in the night. These rules have a practical wisdom that transcends the medieval context. They are essentially the same rules that modern hostel goers are expected to follow. The most carefully organized and extensively documented sleeping arrangements in the medieval world were in monasteries. Monastic communities had explicit, written rules governing every aspect of their members' lives, including sleep, and the documentation that survives from medieval monasteries gives us an unusually detailed picture of how sleep was structured when it was subjected to deliberate institutional planning. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and the foundational document for most Western monasticism, addresses sleep directly and specifically. Monks were to sleep in a common dormitory, each in their own bed. They were to sleep in their habits, the monastic garment, so that they could rise promptly for the night office without needing to dress. A lamp was to burn in the dormitory throughout the night, providing enough light for orientation without disrupting sleep. An elder monk was to be assigned to monitor the dormitory for any disturbance or misconduct. The canonical hours organized the monastic night into a specific structure. After Compline, the last prayer of the evening, the monks went to their beds. They slept in their first sleep until the bell for matins, which came at midnight or shortly after. They rose, went to the chapel, performed the night office, and then returned to bed for their second sleep until lauds just before dawn. This is the two-sleep structure in its most formalized expression, confirmed by institutional design. The monastic dormitory was a space of considerable discipline. Silence was expected at night. The elder monk monitoring the dormitory was specifically tasked with watching for monks who were not sleeping when they should be, or who were awake when they should not be. Late-night conversations were prohibited. Individual behavior in the dormitory was subject to communal observation in a way that even medieval secular sleeping arrangements did not quite match. The physical arrangements varied by the wealth and tradition of the specific monastery. In some establishments, monks slept in a common hall with beds arranged along the walls. In others, individual cells provided somewhat more privacy. The Cistercian reform movement of the 12th century, which emphasized austerity and a return to the original spirit of the rule, often featured simpler dormitory arrangements than older and wealthier establishments. The quality of monastic sleep was the subject of ongoing concern in monastic literature. The challenge of waking at midnight for the night office was real. Rising from deep first sleep at midnight requires effort and discipline even when it is the natural sleep interval, and the cold of unheated medieval stone buildings made the effort more demanding. Various practical recommendations appear in monastic sources: sleeping with feet toward the chapel to facilitate quick rising, developing habits of prompt response to the bell, using the technique of willing oneself awake before the bell rang. The sleeping arrangements of medieval armies on campaign deserve attention, because they represent one of the most difficult sleep environments in the medieval world, and because the constraints of military life produced interesting adaptations of the general medieval sleep pattern. A medieval army on campaign slept wherever and whenever it could, subject to the overriding priorities of military necessity. When a camp was established, the hierarchy of sleeping quality reflected the military hierarchy. Senior commanders might have tents, which at least provided some protection from wind and rain. Officers below them might have smaller tents or lean-tos. Ordinary soldiers slept in the open, around fires, on whatever ground was available. The fire was the central feature of the military camp at night. Soldiers clustered around fires for warmth, and the organization of men around fires. How many, in what arrangement, with what rotation of keeping the fire burning, was a practical problem that every experienced soldier had to solve. A fire that went out in the small hours of a cold night was not just uncomfortable. Depending on the temperature, it could be dangerous. Sentry duty meant that a portion of the army was always awake, monitoring the perimeter against surprise attack. The psychological burden of the night watch, described in medieval military texts as particularly demanding, was compounded by the darkness and by the knowledge that the enemy might be present in that darkness. The night attack was a known tactic of medieval warfare, and the fear of being surprised while asleep was a genuine and rational concern. The quality of sleep available to the ordinary medieval soldier was poor by most standards. The ground was hard and often wet. The noise of a camp, breathing, snoring, the movement of animals, the sounds of a large group of people occupying a space was constant. The cold was often severe, and the blanket or cloak that was each man's primary protection against it was frequently inadequate. And the anxiety of being in hostile territory, with the possibility of attack, was not conducive to deep or restful sleep. Medieval commanders understood that sleep-deprived soldiers fought poorly, and various practical approaches to ensuring adequate rest appear in the military literature. Organizing watch rotations to ensure that every man got a reasonable period of sleep. Choosing camp locations that offered natural protection and allowed sleep with fewer sentries. Establishing pre-battle rest protocols when a major engagement was anticipated. The relationship between sleep and combat effectiveness was well understood in the medieval military world, even if the specific mechanisms were not. The sleeping arrangements for children in the medieval period reflected the broader communal sleeping culture, while also presenting some specific concerns and practices that illuminate medieval attitudes toward childhood. Very young children, infants and toddlers, typically slept with their parents. The family bed was the infant's bed. This was economically necessitated by the reality that most families did not have the space, the furniture, or the bedding to provide separate sleeping arrangements for infants, and it also made practical sense from a feeding perspective. A nursing mother waking for night feeds was less disruptive if she and the infant were in the same bed. The medieval church had concerns about this practice, specifically about the risk of overlying, the accidental suffocation of an infant by an adult who rolled over onto them in the night. Ecclesiastical records from the medieval period contain numerous references to deaths attributed to overlying, and there were periodic campaigns to discourage the practice of sleeping with infants in the parental bed. The medieval concern about overlying is essentially the same concern that modern pediatricians express about bed sharing, and the medieval evidence suggests that the risk was real, though the church's documented concern may have led to an overestimate of its frequency. Medieval cradles and baby beds existed and are documented in household inventories and manuscript illustrations. The cradle, a small rocking bed that could be placed near the adult bed, allowed the infant to be close to the mother without sharing the same sleeping surface. The use of cradles was more common in wealthier households, where the resources to acquire and maintain a separate piece of furniture for the infant were available. Older children past infancy but still young typically slept in the family's shared space, often in a separate but adjacent sleeping area if the house was large enough. As children grew older and the household expanded to include apprentices or servants, the sleeping arrangements became more complex, with older children joining the household's general sleeping arrangements rather than maintaining a separate nursery space. The concept of the nursery, a dedicated room for children's sleep, separate from adults, was largely confined to aristocratic households in the medieval period. The great household with sufficient rooms to dedicate one to children's sleeping was rare, and the elaborate nursery culture that developed in the early modern period was essentially absent in the medieval world. Medieval medicine had a detailed, if incorrect by modern standards, theory of what happened in the body during sleep. Understanding this theory helps explain many of the specific recommendations and practices we have discussed, and it illustrates how thoroughly the medieval approach to sleep was integrated into a broader framework of bodily health. In the humoral system, sleep was understood primarily as a process of digestion and restoration. The body, during the waking hours, was constantly consuming itself. The humors were being used up in the effort of activity, thought, and sensation. Food consumed during the day needed to be processed and transformed into the substances the body needed to maintain itself. And the brain and sense organs, which had been active all day, needed rest and restoration. All of this processing, in the medieval understanding, happened during sleep. The heat of the body during sleep was understood to move inward, from the extremities toward the core, particularly toward the digestive organs, where it could complete the digestion of the day's food. This was why the extremities felt cold during sleep, and why sleeping in warmth was important. The body needed to maintain sufficient heat for its internal processes. The brain during sleep, in the medieval understanding, underwent a specific process of restoration that involved the cooling and moistening of its substance. The brain was conceptualized as a somewhat fragile organ that was heated and dried by the intense activity of waking thought and sensation, and that required the relative quiet and coolness of sleep to recover its proper balance. This is why the medieval physician recommended sleeping positions and environments that would facilitate brain cooling, and why excessive heat was considered detrimental to sleep, since it interfered with this cooling process. Dreams in this physiological framework were produced by the activity of the animal spirits, a subtle substance that carried information between the brain and the sense organs during sleep, when the higher rational faculties were temporarily suspended. The animal spirits, freed from the direction of reason, produced dream images that were influenced by the residue of the day's experiences and by the state of the humors. A person with an excess of bilious humor might have fiery, angry dreams. A person with phlegmatic excess might have cold, watery dreams. The content of dreams was thus, in the medieval medical understanding, diagnostically significant. A physician who heard a patient's dreams could potentially infer something about their humoral state. This diagnostic use of dreams was part of a broader medieval medical practice that integrated sleep observation into medical assessment. How long a patient slept, whether their sleep was disturbed, what they reported dreaming, how they felt upon waking. All of these were medically relevant data points that a medieval physician would gather as part of assessing a patient's health. One aspect of medieval sleep that is easy to overlook is how dramatically it varied with the seasons. In a world without artificial lighting and with sleep organized around darkness, the length and timing of sleep were directly determined by the length of the night, which varies enormously over the course of a year at the latitudes of medieval Europe. In midsummer, at the latitude of England or France, darkness falls around 9 or 10 in the evening and gives way to dawn around 4 or 5 in the morning. This provides approximately 7 to 8 hours of darkness, enough for 2 sleep periods with an interval between them, but barely. In midwinter, the same locations experience darkness from around 4 in the afternoon until 8 in the morning, 16 hours of darkness, potentially twice the summer figure. Medieval sleep patterns adjusted to these seasonal rhythms in ways that modern fixed schedule sleep does not. In summer, people went to bed later, there was more light, more time for work and activity, and the shorter nights meant that sleep came later and ended earlier. In winter, the long darkness meant that the period available for sleep was much longer than the body could comfortably use, and medieval people routinely spent more of the winter night awake than the summer night. The intersleep interval was longer in winter than in summer, for the simple reason that there was more darkness to fill. In summer, the wakeful interval might be relatively brief, 30 minutes or an hour. In winter, with 16 hours of darkness, the interval might extend to 2 or 3 hours, providing considerably more time for prayer, conversation, and the various activities that the medieval night offered. This seasonal variation had social consequences. Winter evenings, the long period between supper and first sleep, were social occasions in a way that summer evenings often were not. People gathered around fires, told stories, played games, sang songs, and generally used the long winter dark as an occasion for communal activity. The tradition of the winter evening social, storytelling by firelight, is one of the oldest human social practices, and it was very much alive in the medieval world. Summer, by contrast, was dominated by agricultural work that extended into the long evenings and began again at dawn, leaving little time for the elaborate social rituals of the winter night. Medieval agricultural communities had a pronounced seasonal rhythm that affected every aspect of life, including sleep. The church calendar was aware of and accommodated this seasonal variation. The times for the canonical hours shifted seasonally, with the summer schedule having less time between the night office and dawn and the winter schedule allowing more. This was practical adaptation to the reality of natural light, not theological flexibility. The church understood that what worked in summer would not work in winter and adjusted accordingly. The concept of sleep hygiene, the set of practices that support good sleep, is often presented as a modern innovation, the product of 20th century sleep research. The reality is that medieval people had extensive practical knowledge about the conditions that supported sleep, and much of what they recommended maps reasonably well onto what modern sleep research has confirmed. The medieval recommendation to eat a moderate supper rather than a heavy late meal is consistent with modern guidance. The advice to avoid hot, spiced, and stimulating drinks before bed, medieval physicians specifically warned against spiced wine taken late in the evening, is essentially a pre-modern version of the modern advice to avoid caffeine and alcohol before sleep. The recommendation to allow some time between activity and sleep to permit the body to calm and the humor to settle is an early version of the modern concept of a wind-down routine. The use of aromatic herbs in the sleeping space, lavender, chamomile, lemon balm, was widespread in the medieval world, based on the practical observation that certain scents seemed to promote relaxation and sleep. Modern aromatherapy research has confirmed that some of these plants do have measurable effects on anxiety and relaxation, though the mechanisms are different from what medieval herbalists imagined. The medieval practice of placing herbs in mattress stuffing or burning herbs in the sleeping space is a direct ancestor of modern sleep-promoting aromatherapy. The recommendation for physical activity during the day as a promoter of nighttime sleep appears in medieval medical texts, though the reasoning, exercise consumes humors that might otherwise cause restlessness, is different from the modern explanation exercise promotes adenosine buildup and circadian alignment. The conclusion is the same. Where medieval sleep hygiene diverges most significantly from modern practice is in the areas of noise, privacy, and light. Modern sleep guidance emphasizes quiet, darkness, and solitude as conditions for good sleep. Medieval people slept in noisy, socially complex environments by choice and necessity, and their sleep appeared to work adequately. This suggests either that the human capacity for adapting to noise and social presence in the sleeping environment is greater than modern guidance implies, or that the habituation effects of a lifetime in a particular sleep environment are so strong that they override the physiological benefits of quiet and solitude. The truth is probably both. Medieval people slept in environments that would challenge modern sleepers, but they had adapted to those environments from birth and experienced them as normal. The optimization of sleep conditions is, to a significant degree, about reducing the gap between expectation and reality. And if your expectation is a communal straw pallet with a dog and a pig, your sleep quality is not being disrupted by the failure to achieve a quiet private room. Medieval sleep was hedged about with a remarkable array of protective practices and superstitious customs, designed to ensure safe passage through the dangerous hours of the night. These practices ranged from the explicitly Christian prayers, the sign of the cross, relics, and holy objects placed near the bed, to the folk magical, herbs, amulets, specific behaviors that were believed to attract or repel supernatural forces. The bedtime prayer was universal and central. Medieval people prayed before sleep in a formal and deliberate way that most modern people do not, even those who consider themselves religious. The prayers were not brief or perfunctory. They were the last spiritual act of the day and were understood as the primary protection against the supernatural dangers of the night. Specific prayers for sleep protection survive in large numbers from the medieval period, some in Latin for the educated clergy, and many in vernacular languages for the ordinary population. The sign of the cross before sleeping was so universal that it barely registers as a specific practice. It was simply what you did when you got into bed, as automatic as a modern person adjusting their pillow. Making the sign of the cross over the bed, over the body, and sometimes over each member of the family present was a standard sequence of bedtime actions. Holy water, blessed by a priest and kept in a small vessel near the bed, was commonly used for sprinkling the sleeping space before lying down. The protective efficacy of holy water against demonic forces was well understood in medieval theology, and its use as a bedtime protective was widespread. The specific holy objects that individuals kept near their beds, crucifixes, images of saints, relics if they could afford them, served both as focal points for prayer and as physical presences of spiritual protection. Folk practices operated alongside and intertwined with the explicitly Christian ones. Specific herbs placed in the mattress or hung near the bed were believed to repel malevolent spirits. Specific behaviors before sleeping, not leaving shoes pointing in a particular direction, not sleeping with the head towards certain points of the compass, were believed to influence the quality of sleep and the nature of dreams. The number of people sleeping in a room had superstitious significance in some traditions. The arrangement of bodies in a bed was sometimes governed by beliefs about which position offered the most protection. The Church's attitude toward these folk practices was ambivalent. Ecclesiastical authorities periodically criticized popular sleep superstitions as superstition rather than true faith. But the same authorities also encouraged the use of holy water, prayer, and religious objects, which were performing the same protective function through a different theoretical framework. The line between legitimate Christian protective practice and illicit folk magic was, in practice, difficult to draw, and many medieval people operated in both frameworks simultaneously without perceiving any contradiction. Medieval theology had a specific and significant understanding of what sleep meant in the cosmic scheme of things, and this understanding gave the act of going to sleep each night a weight and significance that modern secular sleep rarely carries. Sleep in medieval Christian theology was a daily practice of death and resurrection. When you lay down to sleep, you surrendered consciousness, control, and the activities of your rational faculties in a way that was explicitly compared to dying. The person who slept was, in a sense, temporarily absent from the world of the living. And the person who woke from sleep was, in a sense, returning to life, which is why the morning was associated with resurrection, and why waking prayers often took the form of thanksgiving for having been restored to life from the little death of sleep. This theological framework had practical implications. If sleep was a daily death, then the moment of falling asleep required the same spiritual preparation as the moment of actual dying. The soul in sleep was vulnerable in specific ways. The rational faculties that normally directed it were suspended, and the demonic forces that operated through the body and the imagination could act with less resistance. The bedtime prayer was therefore not merely a routine religious observance, but a specific preparation for spiritual vulnerability. The analogy to death also meant that waking from sleep was understood as a gift, not a certainty. Medieval people did not take it for granted that they would wake from sleep. The night prayers include explicit expressions of uncertainty about waking and explicit thanksgiving upon doing so. This is not morbidity, it is realism. Medieval mortality rates were high enough that dying in one's sleep was a common enough occurrence to be a genuine concern rather than a theoretical one. This theological weight given to sleep and waking created a relationship to the night that was fundamentally different from the modern secular experience. For medieval people, going to sleep was an act of trust in God's protection through the dangerous night, trust that the soul's nightly vulnerability would not be exploited by the forces of darkness. Waking was a daily confirmation of that trust, a small daily miracle of continuation. The modern experience of lying awake at night, worried about one's problems, is often accompanied by a sense of futility. The worry is real, but the night offers no resolution. The medieval experience of waking in the inner sleep interval was different in character, because the framework into which it was placed was different. The wakeful hour was not a failure of sleep, but a natural interval protected by prayer, populated by divine presence, if one believed correctly, and surrounded by the rhythms of a universe that had its own reasons for the structure of the night. This may be the most profound difference between medieval sleep and modern sleep. Not the two-sleep pattern, not the communal bed, not the darkness or the animals or the straw mattress, but the framework of meaning within which sleep took place. Medieval sleep was meaningful in a theological and cosmological sense that modern secular sleep is not. And the question of whether something is lost in that translation, whether the absence of that framework contributes to modern sleep difficulties in ways that sleep hygiene advice cannot address, is genuinely worth considering. The word nightmare is one of those words whose etymology is so interesting that it changes how you think about the concept. The mare in nightmare is not a female horse. It is a much older creature from Germanic and Norse mythology, a being called the Mara, a spirit or demon that sat on the chest of a sleeping person and produced the sensation of crushing pressure and terrifying dreams that we now call a nightmare. The Mara and its equivalents across European folk traditions, the French Cauquemer, the German Nachtmar, the Italian Carcafano, was taken completely seriously in the medieval world. Not as a metaphor, not as a psychological explanation for an experience that had a neurological cause. As a real supernatural entity that genuinely, physically attacked sleepers in the night, pressing on their chests, riding them through terrible dream landscapes, and departing before they could wake fully enough to see it. The experience that this mythology was explaining, the sensation of pressure on the chest during sleep, accompanied by vivid and terrifying imagery and the inability to move, is what modern sleep science calls sleep paralysis. This is a well-documented and quite common neurological phenomenon in which the motor paralysis that normally prevents you from acting out your dreams persists briefly into the waking state, producing the sensation of being unable to move while feeling intensely that something threatening is present. Sleep paralysis is neurologically entirely benign. It is disconcerting and can be frightening, but it is the body's sleep architecture briefly desynchronizing, nothing more. Medieval people did not have this explanation. What they had was the Mara, and the Mara explained the experience perfectly. The pressure on the chest, the inability to move, the terrifying imagery, the sudden release when the creature departed. The folklore was, in its own way, a completely accurate description of the phenomenology of sleep paralysis, translated into the supernatural terms available in the medieval world. The remedies for the Mara were correspondingly practical within their theoretical framework. Since the Mara was a spiritual entity, spiritual protections were primary. Prayers, holy water, religious objects near the bed, specific protective verbal formulae spoken before sleeping. Iron was believed to repel the Mara in some traditions. Leaving iron objects near the sleeping space was a folk remedy. Certain herbs, particularly those with strong smells, were believed to drive the Mara away. Specific sleeping positions were recommended that would deny the Mara access to the chest. Some of these recommendations, particularly regarding sleeping position, may have had some actual effect, since sleep paralysis is more common when sleeping on the back and less common in other positions. The medieval advice to avoid supine sleeping, which appeared in the medical literature for humoral reasons, may have had the incidental benefit of reducing sleep paralysis episodes, which would have been experienced as a reduction in Mara attacks. The social dimension of the Mara experience is worth noting. In a medieval household where multiple people shared a sleeping space, a person experiencing sleep paralysis would not be having the experience in isolation. If they vocalized, and people in sleep paralysis sometimes do, they would disturb their bedfellows. If they then woke suddenly and described what had happened, the experience would immediately become a shared social event, interpreted through the shared framework of the Mara mythology. The communal sleeping arrangement meant that sleep disorders were, in a sense, communal experiences rather than isolated ones. Pilgrimage was one of the most common reasons for medieval people to travel, and the pilgrim's experience of sleep across the medieval road network illustrates many of the themes we have discussed, while adding specific challenges unique to the pilgrim's situation. A medieval pilgrim on a major route, the Camino de Santiago, the road to Canterbury, the Via Francigena to Rome, might be on the road for weeks or months, sleeping in a different place every night or every few nights, in accommodation that ranged from dedicated pilgrim hospitals to the open road with nothing but a cloak for warmth. The pilgrim's sleep situation was therefore the most variable and challenging version of the general medieval sleep experience. The pilgrimage networks maintained a specific infrastructure of accommodation. Religious houses along the major routes were expected to provide hospitality to pilgrims. This was a religious obligation, not a commercial arrangement. The quality of accommodation provided varied enormously. A wealthy monastery might offer reasonably comfortable beds, good food, and even medical care to sick pilgrims. A small rural priory might offer nothing more than a place in the barn with the livestock, which, as we have established, was not actually the worst available. The dedicated pilgrim hospital, the Hospitium, was a specific institution that developed specifically to serve pilgrim traffic. These were not hospitals in the modern medical sense but rest houses, places where pilgrims could sleep, eat, and recover from the rigors of the road. The larger ones on major routes could accommodate hundreds of pilgrims simultaneously, in common sleeping halls where people of every nationality, language, social class, and degree of physical health were crowded together. The pilgrim experience of sleep was therefore the communal bed experience taken to its most extreme. You were sleeping with people you had never met, from places you might not even know, in states of health that ranged from normal travel fatigue to the contagious illness that had motivated some pilgrims to seek healing at the shrine. The disease risks of pilgrim accommodation were real, plague, dysentery, and other infectious diseases spread efficiently through the dense population of pilgrim hospitals on major routes. What pilgrims sought, in their sleeping arrangements as in everything else on the road, was a balance between practical need and spiritual meaning. The hardship of the road, including its sleeping hardships, was part of the pilgrimage. The willingness to sleep badly, to share accommodation with strangers, to endure discomfort without complaint, was an expression of the spirit of humility and trust that pilgrimage was supposed to cultivate. A pilgrim who insisted on comfortable private accommodation and selected his bedfellows carefully was arguably missing the point of the exercise. The arrival at the destination, the shrine, the holy city, was often followed by a period of collapse and recovery that mixed genuine physical exhaustion with spiritual experience. Pilgrims who had been sleeping poorly for weeks on the road would often sleep deeply and extensively once they reached their destination, and the quality of this sleep was attributed to the spiritual efficacy of the place rather than to simple physical exhaustion. Miraculous cures at pilgrimage sites frequently involved sleep. The pilgrim who fell asleep before the shrine and woke healed was a recognized category of pilgrimage miracle. The practice of singing children to sleep is one of the oldest and most universal human behaviors, and the medieval world had its own version of it. Medieval lullabies survive in significant numbers in English, French, German, Latin, and other languages, and they reveal something interesting about the medieval understanding of children, sleep, and the night. The medieval lullaby had several functions simultaneously. It was, at the most immediate level, a practical tool for settling an infant or young child. The repetitive rhythm, the gentle vocal tone, and the sustained adult presence it provided were as effective then as they are now for calming an agitated small person. On this basic level, the medieval lullaby is entirely continuous with the modern one. But the medieval lullaby also carried theological content that modern lullabies typically do not. The texts of surviving medieval lullabies frequently include prayers for the child's protection through the night, invocations of specific saints as protectors, and acknowledgments of the dangers, both natural and supernatural, that the child might face in the sleeping hours. The lullaby was, in part, a bedtime prayer on behalf of a child too young to pray for themselves. Some medieval lullabies are notably serious in content. The famous Middle English lullaby, My Sweet Little Baby, addressed by Mary to the infant Jesus, meditates on the suffering that will come to the child being sung to sleep, using the lullaby form to deliver theological content about the incarnation and the passion. This combination of comfort and weight, of soothing melody and serious subject matter, is characteristic of medieval children's culture more broadly. The transition of children from being sung to sleep as infants to being expected to join the general household sleeping arrangements was gradual, and the specific age at which this occurred varied by social class. In wealthy households, children might retain a nurse who managed their sleeping arrangements well into childhood. In ordinary households, the transition from dedicated infant care to participation in the household's communal sleep was probably quite early, driven by practical necessity. The stories told in medieval households to children before sleep, what we might call bedtime stories, though the medieval term would have been different, were not the sanitized fairy tales of the 19th century tradition. They drew on a much wider range of material: saints' lives, which served both as religious instruction and entertainment; folk tales that often featured genuine danger and violence; animal fables from the Aesopic tradition that carried moral messages alongside entertainment; and the shared narratives of local history and legend that formed a community's sense of its own identity. The moral and educational purpose of pre-sleep storytelling was explicit in medieval culture. This was a time when the mind was calm, the child was receptive, and the guidance received would be processed during sleep into lasting memory. The idea that what you hear before sleep is retained more effectively is a claim that modern sleep researchers have investigated, with some supportive findings. Medieval educators, who had arrived at the same conclusion by observation and theory, were treating pre-sleep as a special pedagogical opportunity. The medieval sailors' experience of sleep was perhaps the most constrained and uncomfortable of any regular occupation in the medieval world. Ships were small, wet, cold, noisy, in constant motion, and organized around watch rotations that fragmented sleep into brief intervals across a 24-hour cycle. The sailor's relationship with sleep was fundamentally different from any land-based version of medieval sleep, and it deserves separate attention. Medieval ships were working vessels in which every square foot was occupied by equipment, cargo, or crew. The crew did not have dedicated sleeping quarters in any meaningful sense. They slept where they could under the rowing benches of galleys, in the bow or stern areas between other gear, wrapped in cloaks against the spray and the cold. On larger merchant vessels, crew quarters were somewhat better organized, but the fundamental shortage of comfortable sleeping space was universal. The watch system, a rotation in which portions of the crew were awake and on duty while others slept, meant that the sailor's sleep was always partial and fragmented. A typical medieval watch system divided the crew into watches that alternated duty every few hours, meaning that no one ever got more than a few hours of continuous sleep before being called back on duty. The two-sleep pattern of land-based medieval life was replaced by something more extreme, a pattern of multiple brief sleep intervals scattered through the day and night. The sounds of a medieval ship at sea were nothing like the sounds of a medieval house. The constant motion, the ship rising and falling on swells, the impact of waves against the hull, produced a physical experience of sleeping that bore no resemblance to sleeping in a bed. The ropes and rigging made constant noise. The wind, when present, was unrelenting. The crash of the sea was ever present. And yet sailors slept through all of this, because the alternative was no sleep at all. The medieval understanding of seasickness, the nausea and discomfort produced by the motion of a ship, touched on sleep, because seasickness made sleeping difficult in the same way that it made everything difficult. Medieval medical texts address the condition, generally attributing it to the disturbance of the humors by the motion, and recommending various remedies including fasting, specific foods, and often simply lying down and trying to sleep through it. This last recommendation has a modern equivalent in the frequent medical advice to try to sleep through mild to moderate motion sickness. The relationship between sleep and sexual life in the medieval period was more intertwined than in the modern world, primarily because the physical arrangements that separated sleeping from sexuality, private bedrooms, personal space, independence from the household, were largely absent for most medieval people. The communal sleeping arrangements of the medieval household meant that sexual activity occurred in the presence, or at least the potential awareness, of other household members. Walls between sleeping people were often thin or absent. Children slept in the same rooms as parents. Servants slept in adjacent spaces. The acoustic privacy that modern couples take for granted simply did not exist for most of the medieval population. Medieval theology addressed the question of marital sexuality with considerable explicitness, including specific guidance on the relationship between sleep and sex. We have already noted that the intersleep interval, the wakeful period between first and second sleep, was specifically recommended in medieval medical literature as the optimal time for sexual intercourse. This recommendation appears in multiple medical texts and was based on the humoral theory that the body was in an ideal state of warmth and moisture at this point in the night. The Church's guidance on the timing of marital relations included various restrictions on certain days and periods: Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, the days before communion, during menstruation, during pregnancy, and during nursing. But these restrictions did not specifically address the time of night, leaving the intersleep interval free of any special prohibition. The practical consequence of the communal sleeping arrangements was a degree of normalization of the fact that sexual activity was occurring in proximity to other people that modern culture would find uncomfortable. Children who grew up in a one-room household were not ignorant of what adults did in bed. They were simply surrounded by it in the way that they were surrounded by other adult activities. Medieval society managed this reality through the general framework of ordinary life, rather than through the specific mechanisms of privacy and sequestration that the modern world uses. The bridal chamber, the specific room in which a newly married couple spent their first night, was a ritually significant space in aristocratic and wealthy contexts. The blessing of the marriage bed by a priest was a recognized liturgical practice, in which the bed was sprinkled with holy water and specific prayers were offered for the couple's fertility and well-being. The consummation of the marriage had legal significance as well as personal significance, and its occurrence or non-occurrence could have legal consequences for the validity of the marriage itself. The sleep of the very poor and the very vulnerable in the medieval world deserves specific attention, because it represents the extreme end of the spectrum we have been discussing, the point at which the practical challenges of medieval sleep became matters of survival rather than comfort. The homeless poor of medieval cities, the beggars, the vagabonds, the genuinely destitute, slept wherever they could find shelter from the elements. Under bridges, in doorways, in the porches of churches, in the abandoned outbuildings of more prosperous citizens. The medieval city was not without provision for the very poor. The church maintained a network of almshouses and charitable institutions, but these were always oversubscribed, and the excess slept in whatever urban shelter could be found. The specific danger for the destitute sleeper in the medieval city was cold. The hypothermia risk for a poorly clothed person sleeping outside in a medieval winter was not trivial. Medieval chronicles contain references to poor people found dead of cold in urban streets, particularly during the hard winters that punctuated the medieval period. The clustering of the poor in whatever sheltered space could be found was a response to this specific survival threat, and the body heat of a group sleeping in proximity was a genuine resource in the calculation. Prisoners in medieval dungeons faced a different but equally harsh version of the sleep problem. The medieval prison was not designed with comfort in mind. Stone cells, damp floors, inadequate bedding if any at all, noise, cold, and the psychological weight of imprisonment combined to make sleep in a medieval dungeon genuinely difficult. Medieval chronicles that include accounts of imprisonment often mention the difficulty of sleep as one of the specific hardships of the incarcerated life. The ecclesiastical sanctuary, a church or churchyard in which criminals and those in fear of violence could take refuge under the church's protection, had specific sleeping provisions in some medieval legal frameworks. A sanctuary seeker who had fled to a church could remain for a specified period, typically 40 days, during which they were protected from arrest. They slept in the church, which was considerably more comfortable than a dungeon but not a pleasant place to spend several weeks. Lepers, whose condition was both a medical reality and a powerful social symbol in the medieval world, were required in many jurisdictions to live separately from the non-leprous population. The leprosarium, the institution established to house lepers, was typically located outside the town walls and provided a form of communal life that, while separated from the general population, was itself organized around communal sleeping arrangements similar to those of other medieval institutions. The transformation from the medieval sleep pattern, the two sleeps, the communal bed, the darkness, the church bell time, to the modern sleep pattern happened gradually, across a period of roughly 3 to 4 centuries beginning in the early modern period, and it was driven by a combination of technological, economic, and cultural changes that reinforced each other in ways that were probably not fully intended by anyone. The first and most important change was artificial lighting. The improvement of oil lamp technology in the 16th and 17th centuries, followed by the development of gas lighting in the early 19th century and electric lighting in the late 19th, progressively pushed back the darkness that had structured medieval sleep. When darkness came at 9 p.m. and there was nothing to do in the dark, going to bed at 9 made sense. When gas lighting allowed activities to continue until midnight, the pressure to go to bed early was reduced. The second major change was the development of regular paid employment with fixed hours. The Industrial Revolution, which we discussed at length in our last episode on the Victorian factory, created a labor market in which workers were expected to be at a specific place at a specific time, regardless of natural rhythms. The factory bell and the factory clock replaced the church bell, and the seasons as the organizers of daily time. If you had to be at the factory at 6 in the morning, you could not afford the flexible relationship with waking time that the agricultural medieval household had maintained. The third change was urbanization and the associated changes in housing. The emergence of the separate bedroom as a standard feature of respectable housing, something that happened at different rates in different social classes throughout the 19th century, created the physical precondition for private sleep. When there was a separate bedroom with a door that could be closed, the communal sleeping arrangement became unnecessary. And once it became unnecessary, it also became unseemly. The privacy norm, once established by physical possibility, became a moral expectation. The fourth change was the development of a medical framework for sleep that pathologized the medieval pattern. By the late 19th century, medical and scientific advice about sleep was increasingly focused on the 8-hour continuous sleep as the normal and healthy standard. Waking in the middle of the night, the perfectly natural and biologically normal intersleep interval, began to be described in medical literature as a symptom of nervous disorder, of anxiety, of insufficient physical fatigue. The long tradition of the two sleeps was forgotten so completely that by the 20th century, the very existence of the pattern had to be rediscovered by historians researching historical documents. Eckertsch's 2001 paper, which brought the historical evidence for segmented sleep to wide attention, was received by the sleep research community as a significant finding, not because the evidence was difficult to find in historical texts, but because the possibility that the standard human sleep pattern had been fundamentally different in the recent historical past had simply not been considered. The medical literature had so thoroughly naturalized the single-block 8-hour sleep that its historical contingency had been forgotten. Having spent all this time with medieval sleep, its two periods, its communal arrangements, its darkness, its prayers, its mares, and its bells, it is worth stepping back and asking what, if anything, we might have lost in the transition to modern sleep culture. This is not a question about whether we should return to medieval conditions. We should not. Medieval life was hard in ways that modern life is not, and the improvements in housing, heating, public health, and personal safety that have transformed the human sleep environment are genuine improvements. The straw mattress shared with a pig is not preferable to the memory foam mattress in a climate-controlled private room. This is not a question of whether we should go back. But there are specific things about the medieval relationship to sleep that are worth considering on their own merits, because they reflect genuine insights about human biology and human psychology that we have, in some ways, moved away from. The two-sleep structure was, by all available evidence, aligned with human biology rather than fighting it. The fact that it has been rediscovered by sleep researchers as a natural human pattern, after having been pathologized as insomnia for several generations, suggests that we may have been treating normal human variation as a disorder. The person who wakes at midnight, spends an hour in contemplation or quiet activity, and then goes back to sleep is not broken. They are doing what their biology has always wanted to do. The communal sleeping arrangement had psychological costs, lack of privacy, lack of quiet, but it also had benefits that we have undervalued. The presence of other people in the sleeping space is, for many human beings, a source of comfort and security rather than disturbance. The isolation of the private bedroom, which modern culture has naturalized as the preferred sleeping arrangement, may not suit all human temperaments equally well. The person who sleeps better with others nearby is not immature or dependent. They may simply be responding to deep social instincts that the private bedroom frustrates. The medieval darkness was genuinely different from any darkness modern people experience, and the sleep it produced may have been deeper and more complete as a result. The blue light of screens that delays melatonin production in modern sleepers is the opposite of the complete darkness that surrounded medieval sleep. The medieval sleeper going to bed by a dying fire in a lightless house was in precisely the light conditions that human sleep physiology was shaped by over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. We have, in 2 centuries, moved to a light environment that is unprecedented in human history, and we are still learning what the full consequences of this change are for sleep quality. The spiritual framework that gave medieval sleep its meaning is, of course, not universally available to modern people. But the core insight that the night is a specific and significant part of human experience, deserving of deliberate attention and a kind of mental preparation, does not require any particular theological commitment to appreciate. The idea that lying down to sleep is a transition that benefits from a deliberate moment of acknowledgement, of putting the day behind you and orienting yourself toward the night, is not confined to Christian theology. It is available to anyone who is willing to treat the transition to sleep as something more than simply falling unconscious. Medieval chronicles occasionally preserve specific details about the sleeping habits of famous people, and these details, while fragmentary and often unreliable, give us glimpses of how historical figures navigated the universal human need for sleep within the constraints and possibilities of their particular situations. Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, is reported by his biographer Einhard to have been a light and frequently interrupted sleeper, who would rise several times in the night to walk about and pray. He was also said to have been troubled by dreams that he took seriously, sometimes consulting his advisors about their interpretation before taking political decisions. The image of Charlemagne pacing his palace in the small hours, wrestling with imperial decisions and his own nighttime visions, is entirely consistent with what we know about the sleep patterns of the medieval world. Various medieval kings and princes are documented as having difficulty sleeping during periods of political stress. The night before a major battle, we are told in multiple sources, was typically a sleepless one for medieval commanders, and indeed for the soldiers under their command. Pre-battle anxiety and its effects on sleep appear frequently in medieval narrative sources, sometimes as a demonstration of the leader's conscientiousness. He was too worried about his men to sleep, and sometimes as a sign of divine favor. He slept soundly because God had assured him of victory. Saints frequently appeared to other people during their sleeping hours in the medieval chronicles. The vision received in the intersleep interval, or in a dream of the first or second sleep, was a recognized mode of divine communication. The specific detail that a vision came in the middle of the night, between the two sleeps, appears often enough in hagiographic literature to suggest that the author understood this as a theologically significant time. The moment when the rational mind was not fully occupied and the channel to the divine was most open. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest medieval theologians, is said to have composed much of his philosophical and theological work by dictating to secretaries during periods of waking in the night. Whether this refers specifically to the intersleep interval or to more general night waking is not entirely clear from the sources, but it illustrates the medieval understanding that the night hours were not merely for sleep, but could be productive for the right kind of mental work, contemplative, theological, or creative work that benefited from quiet and calm rather than requiring the active engagement of the day. We have touched on the differences between how different social classes slept throughout this discussion, but it is worth bringing these observations together in a summary that makes the spectrum clear. At the very top of medieval society, royalty, the great nobility, the wealthiest clergy, the physical conditions of sleep were considerably better than those available to most of the population. A great lord had access to a proper bed with a feather mattress, linen sheets, and wool blankets. He had a sleeping chamber that, while not fully private, was restricted to people of appropriate status. He had servants whose job included ensuring his comfort through the night. He could afford candles that would allow the intersleep interval to be spent in reading or writing if he wished. His food was better, which meant his digestion was less likely to disturb his sleep. His house was better built, better heated, and drier than those of his tenants. At the middle range, the prosperous craftsman, the successful merchant, the parish priest with a proper house, conditions were decent but significantly less comfortable. A reasonable bed, probably shared with a spouse and possibly with children. Adequate bedding, though perhaps not linen sheets. A house with a proper fireplace that provided reasonable warmth in winter. The intersleep interval spent in darkness or by a single candle. Food adequate to nutrition, if not particularly varied or digestive friendly. At the bottom, the landless laborer, the journeyman who had not found employment, the rural poor. Sleeping conditions were harsh by any standard. A straw pallet on the floor, inadequate blankets, a cold and drafty house or no house at all. Food that was barely adequate and occasionally not even that. Sleep disrupted by cold, by hunger, by the sounds of animals, by the noise of others in the same cramped space, and by the anxieties of a life conducted on the permanent edge of survival. What is striking, when you look at the full spectrum, is how much more variation there was within the medieval world than there is within the modern developed world. A wealthy medieval lord slept in conditions that were, in some ways, not far from comfortable. A great bed with curtains is not fundamentally different from a modern four-poster. But the medieval poor slept in conditions that would, in the modern developed world, constitute a public health crisis. The range was enormous. What was consistent across all social classes was the temporal structure. The two sleeps, the intersleep interval, the darkness-organized schedule, the church bells as public time markers. This structure was not a consequence of poverty or wealth. It was a consequence of the human biology operating within the natural light cycle. Rich and poor alike slept in two periods. Rich and poor alike woke at midnight. Rich and poor alike organized their nights around the church bells and the rhythm of the natural world. The specific conditions differed enormously. The underlying pattern was shared. The medieval morning wake-up was a gradual and communal process, very different from the modern experience of an alarm clock ripping one from unconsciousness at a predetermined moment, regardless of where in the sleep cycle one happens to be. In the absence of mechanical alarms, which barely existed in the medieval period in any form that ordinary people had access to, the medieval morning was announced by natural and environmental signals. The rooster's crow at dawn was the most reliable and universal. The gradual lightening of the sky, visible even through small medieval windows, was a gentler signal. The sounds of the household beginning to stir, the fire being stoked by an early rising servant, the animals in the adjacent stable beginning their morning noise, created a gradual acoustic transition from the quiet of the sleeping night to the activity of the morning. This gradual awakening process was more aligned with the natural conclusion of sleep than the alarm clock is. Waking from sleep when the body is ready, at the natural end of a sleep cycle rather than in the middle of one, produces the subjective experience of feeling rested rather than groggy. The medieval person who woke to the gradual signals of dawn was more likely to be waking from a natural sleep ending than the modern person, whose alarm interrupts a sleep cycle at an arbitrary point. The morning prayers, the liturgical hours of lauds and prime, corresponding to first light and sunrise, provided a structured beginning to the day. Rising, saying the morning prayer, and beginning the day's work was a sequence that oriented the morning in the same way that evening prayers and the first sleep oriented the night. The transition from sleep to waking was a marked and deliberate transition, with its own rituals and its own spiritual significance. The first activity of the waking morning varied by social class and occupation. For the agricultural laborer, dawn meant going to the fields. The working day in an agricultural community was organized around natural light, and the long summer days meant extremely early starts. For the monastic community, lauds the dawn prayer was followed by a brief period of lectio divina, sacred reading, before the main activities of the day began. For the urban craftsman, the morning meant opening the workshop or stall, beginning the production or commercial activity that was the core of the day. For the lord and his household, the morning began with a greater degree of ceremony. The lord's waking was attended by servants who brought water for washing, clothing in appropriate order, and the first meal of the day. The elaborate morning ritual of the great household, which is documented in detail in the household ordinances that survive from major medieval establishments, was a daily performance of status and authority as much as a practical beginning to the day. The material goods associated with medieval sleep, beds, mattresses, sheets, blankets, pillows, were significant economic assets in the medieval world, and their ownership, maintenance, and transmission reflect the economic structures of medieval society in interesting ways. The great bed of a medieval lord was literally one of the most valuable objects in his household. Contemporary estate inventories, which survive in considerable numbers for the later medieval period, list beds and their associated furnishings in extraordinary detail, with valuations that reflect their importance. A fully equipped great bed with carved frame, canopy, curtains of good fabric, feather mattress, linen sheets, and wool blankets might represent a very substantial portion of a household's total movable wealth. The transmission of beds and bedding in medieval wills is consistent and tells us something about their perceived value. Middle-class medieval testators, the prosperous merchants, the yeoman farmers, the successful craftsmen, regularly bequeathed specific beds and pieces of bedding to specific heirs, distinguishing between the best bed and lesser beds, between fine linen and ordinary linen, between the good wool blanket and the older one. These were not casual gifts, they were deliberate allocations of significant assets. The rental of sleeping space was an important part of the medieval urban economy. Innkeepers, obviously, sold sleeping accommodation as their primary business. But urban landlords also rented individual beds or portions of sleeping space to lodgers, and the income from this letting was an important supplement to household income in towns. The regulation of lodging, who could take in lodgers, under what conditions, at what prices, was a concern of medieval urban authorities who understood that the provision of sleeping space was a significant economic activity. The laundry problem was another economic dimension of medieval sleep. Linen sheets, when available, required regular washing, and washing linen in the medieval period was a significant labor investment. The lye solution used for washing, the physical effort of beating and wringing heavy wet fabric, the drying time required, all of these made laundry a major household task. The frequency with which bedding was actually washed in practice varied by social class and circumstance, and the gap between the ideal of clean linen and the reality of medieval laundry logistics was significant. Wealthy households that could afford servants specifically assigned to laundry had cleaner bedding than those that could not. The use of music to facilitate sleep in the medieval world was not confined to infants. In wealthy households, the lord might have musicians play while the household retired, a soft and quiet performance that eased the transition from the activity of the evening to the first sleep. This was a luxury available only to those who could afford to keep resident musicians or engage them for the evening, but it was not uncommon in great households. The specific music considered appropriate for sleep differed from music appropriate for dancing, feasting, or religious observance. Medieval musical theorists, drawing on ancient Greek ideas about the effects of musical modes on the emotions and the body, distinguished between modes that excited the passions and those that calmed them. The Dorian mode and the Lydian mode were associated with different emotional effects, and a skilled medieval musician choosing music to help a household sleep would select accordingly. Singing was also used to help sleepers move from the intersleep interval back into the second sleep. A mother might sing to herself or to her children after waking at midnight. A husband unable to sleep might hum quietly. The vocal production, with its controlled breathing and repetitive rhythm, probably had some genuine calming effect, the physiological parallel to what modern research has found about the relationship between controlled breathing and parasympathetic nervous system activity. Bells were another form of sound that medieval people associated with sleep, not the sharp alarm bell, but the deep, slow tolling of the large church bells that marked the canonical hours. The specific qualities of a large bell's sound, the slow decay, the rich harmonic content, the physical resonance that you feel as much as hear, have a quality that is genuinely conducive to a particular kind of drowsy attention. The medieval person lying awake between sleeps, hearing the distant toll of the midnight bell, was hearing a sound that their whole life had associated with the proper pace of the night. The flip side of the medieval appreciation for sleep was an awareness of what happened when sleep was denied, and the medieval world's coercive institutions used this knowledge in ways that the historical record documents with uncomfortable directness. Sleep deprivation was used as a form of torture and coercion in the medieval period, though it was less systematically documented than physical torture. The basic mechanism, keeping a prisoner awake through noise, physical disturbance, cold, or the simple assignment of guards whose job was to prevent sleep, was well understood. A person deprived of sleep for long enough becomes confused, distressed, and increasingly willing to say whatever they believe their interrogators want to hear. This was as true in the medieval period as it is now, and it was exploited accordingly. The witch trials of the later medieval and early modern period provide disturbing documentation of sleep deprivation as an interrogation technique. Accused witches who were kept awake for extended periods, sometimes by the technique of walking them, forcing them to walk back and forth under guard so that they could not sit or lie down, would eventually confess to almost anything, including elaborate descriptions of Sabbaths, pacts with the devil, and other activities that they had certainly not engaged in. The confessions extracted under these conditions were treated as valid evidence, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which sleep-deprived confessions produced more arrests, more sleep-deprived interrogations, and more confessions. The experience of prolonged sleep deprivation in the medieval context was almost entirely undescribed from the perspective of the person undergoing it. We have official records and interrogators' notes, not the subjective reports of the deprived. But the medical literature of the period was aware that extreme sleep deprivation could produce hallucinations, confusion, and eventually death. And the use of sleep denial as a technique of coercion was practiced with some awareness of its effects. The theological dimension of sleep deprivation worked in both directions. On one hand, excessive sleep was associated with the sin of sloth. The failure to use the waking hours productively in work and prayer was a moral failing that the Church regularly addressed in its preaching. On the other hand, deliberate denial of sleep as a spiritual discipline was a recognized ascetic practice. Monks and holy men who reduced their sleep, rising early, retiring late, minimizing the intersleep interval, were practicing a specific form of bodily mortification that was considered spiritually valuable. The most extreme version of this was the ascetic who tried to eliminate sleep entirely, or nearly so. Medieval hagiographies contain accounts of saints who slept barely at all, sustained by divine grace rather than normal biological requirements. These accounts are not reliable as literal descriptions of what these individuals actually did. The human body cannot actually survive without sleep, but they reflect the cultural valuation of wakefulness and the association between diminished sleep and heightened spiritual awareness. Medieval Europe was not a uniform cultural environment, and sleep practices varied by region, climate, and local tradition in ways that the broad picture we have painted does not fully capture. A brief tour of regional variations adds texture to the general picture. In southern Europe, the Mediterranean world of Italy, southern France, Spain, and Greece, the hot summer climate produced specific sleep adaptations that northern Europeans did not share. The siesta, the midday rest during the hottest part of the day, was a recognized and practiced feature of Mediterranean life in the medieval period, and it represents a modification of the basic sleep pattern that was specific to the climatic context. Where a northern European had a two-sleep night pattern, a southern European might add a brief midday sleep to their pattern, creating a more explicitly triphasic structure. The hot summer nights of the Mediterranean also affected nighttime sleep. Where a northern European might be concerned primarily with staying warm enough to sleep, a southern European in summer was concerned with staying cool enough. Sleeping outdoors or with maximum ventilation was a feature of Mediterranean summer sleep that had no direct equivalent in the north. The specific bedding arrangements, the clothing worn or not worn to sleep in, and the choice of sleeping location were all shaped by the need to manage summer heat rather than winter cold. In Scandinavia, at the northern extreme of European settlement, the extreme seasonal variation in day length produced sleep patterns that diverged from the Central European norm in interesting ways. The near-continuous daylight of midsummer in Norway or Sweden meant that the darkness-organized sleep structure was fundamentally disrupted for part of the year. Evidence for how medieval Scandinavians handled this is sparse, but the practical reality of trying to maintain a sleep pattern organized around darkness when there was no darkness for weeks is obvious enough. The winter equivalent in Scandinavia, the near-continuous darkness of the polar winter, may have promoted especially long sleep periods, with the two sleeps and the interval together constituting a very large portion of the 24-hour day. The Norse concept of the winter as a time of introspection, of indoor life, of the telling of sagas in firelit halls, may be related to a sleep pattern in which the long dark nights naturally extended the available sleeping time. In the monasteries of Ireland and northern England, the Celtic Christian tradition had its own specific approach to the night and to the canonical hours. The Celtic Church had historically been somewhat more relaxed about the strict timing of the canonical hours, and the physical conditions of Celtic monastic sites, often isolated, often extremely austere, produced sleeping conditions that were harsher than those of the more comfortable continental monasteries. The Irish ascetic tradition's willingness to embrace extreme physical discomfort as a spiritual discipline included specific forms of sleep deprivation and uncomfortable sleeping conditions that were deliberately sought rather than merely endured. The later medieval period, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, saw a gradual improvement in the sleeping conditions available to the middle classes of prosperous European cities, and this improvement is worth noting because it represents the beginning of the trajectory that leads to modern sleep conditions. The development of urban prosperity in the high medieval period created a growing class of merchants, craftsmen, and professionals who had the resources to invest in comfort in ways that earlier generations of their social class had not. Among the investments that this class made was in better sleeping conditions. The featherbed, previously a luxury confined to the very wealthy, became accessible to prosperous burghers in major trading cities like Bruges, Florence, and London during the 14th century. Medieval guild records and probate inventories from the later medieval period show the gradual penetration of featherbed ownership through the middle classes of trading cities. A successful cloth merchant in Florence in 1380 might well own a featherbed. The same merchant's grandfather in 1300 almost certainly did not. The improvement in sleeping comfort over 3 or 4 generations was, for the middle classes of prosperous medieval cities, genuinely significant. The development of the private sleeping chamber as a desirable feature of urban housing also belongs to the later medieval period. As urban housing became more complex and multi-storied, and as the prosperity of the merchant class increased, the notion that a bedroom could be separate from the main living space of the house, that sleep could happen behind a closed door, began to spread downward through the social hierarchy. The wealthy had always had this possibility. The middle class had it from the later Middle Ages. The poor would not have it until the 20th century, and only in the most prosperous countries. There is a small but charming subset of medieval intellectual inquiry that addresses the question of whether animals dream, and it is worth a brief visit because it illustrates the way the medieval mind approached the experience of sleep, with genuine curiosity about the nature of the experience itself. The observation that sleeping dogs and other animals moved their legs, made sounds, and appeared to be acting out some kind of experience was available to any medieval person who lived in close proximity to animals, which, as we have established, was everyone. The twitching of a sleeping dog's legs, the sounds that animals made in sleep, the apparent expressions of emotion on sleeping animal faces, all of these were observed and noted. The medieval philosophical tradition inherited from Aristotle a framework for thinking about the animal soul, the sensitive soul, distinct from the rational soul that was the exclusive property of human beings. And this framework provided a basis for arguing that animals, while incapable of reason, were capable of the sensory and imaginative experiences that produced dreams. If dreams were produced by the activity of the sensitive faculties during sleep, and if animals possessed sensitive faculties, then animals could plausibly dream. This was not a unanimous conclusion. Some medieval philosophers argued that the movements of sleeping animals were merely mechanical, the continuation of nervous impulses from waking activity, not the expression of any genuine inner experience. Others argued that the appearance of dreaming in animals was deceptive, and that only beings with rational souls could have genuine experiences. What is charming about this debate is that it was taken seriously, that medieval thinkers found the question of what was happening in the mind of a sleeping dog to be genuinely worth intellectual attention. The close physical proximity of medieval people to their animals, the daily observation of animal behavior including sleep behavior, created a relationship to animals that was in some ways more attentive than the distance that modern urban life imposes. The medieval pharmacy of sleep-inducing substances was considerably more extensive than the modern casual reader might expect, and considerably more cautious than the popular image of the medieval apothecary suggests. Medieval healers who prepared soporific remedies, preparations intended to induce or improve sleep, were working within a pharmacological tradition that had been refined over centuries, and they were aware of the dangers of overdose in a way that the ignorant medieval caricature does not allow for. The primary soporific herbs of the medieval pharmacopoeia were well established, and their use was documented in multiple traditions. Opium poppy, grown widely in medieval Europe for legitimate medical purposes, was used in carefully measured doses to induce sleep in patients who were otherwise unable to rest. The preparation was typically a decoction or a syrup, and the dosing was calibrated by the physician or apothecary with genuine care, because the difference between a therapeutic and a lethal dose of opium preparations was known. Mandrake root, whose dramatic folklore it screams when pulled from the ground, all who hear it die, tended to overshadow its genuine pharmacological properties, contains tropine alkaloids that have sedative effects at appropriate doses and toxic effects at higher ones. Medieval physicians used mandrake preparations, but they were aware of the risks, and the texts warn repeatedly about the dangers of excessive dosing. The soporific sponge, a preparation described in medieval surgical texts in which a sponge was soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, henbane, and other soporific substances, and then held under the nose of a patient to induce unconsciousness before surgery, represents the medieval approach to surgical anesthesia. Whether this preparation actually worked as described, or how reliably, is debated among historians of medicine. But the principle was sound, and the pharmacological substances involved do have genuine sedative effects. Valerian root, which modern consumers can purchase in any health food shop as a sleep supplement, was a well-known medieval soporific, described in the major medieval herbals as effective against insomnia and nervous restlessness. The medieval name for valerian in some traditions, all heal, reflects its broad reputation for therapeutic value. Whether valerian actually improves sleep has been studied repeatedly in modern clinical trials, with inconsistent results. The medieval conviction that it worked was based on centuries of clinical observation, even if that observation was not controlled in any modern sense. Lettuce, chamomile, lemon balm, and passion flower were all used in medieval sleep preparations with varying degrees of theoretical justification and practical effectiveness. The consumption of warm drinks before bed, wine with honey and herbs or herb infusions, was a recognized sleep-promoting practice, and the combination of warmth, mild alcohol in the wine version, and whatever herbal constituents were present probably did have some genuine sedative effect, at least through the mechanism of simple warmth and relaxation. There is one specific piece of medieval adjacent sleeping furniture that deserves mention, because it is both extraordinary and instructive about the relationship between beds and status in the pre-modern world. The Great Bed of Ware, now housed in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, is an enormous carved oak bed dating from around 1590, technically Elizabethan rather than medieval, but so directly continuous with the medieval tradition that it belongs in this discussion. The Great Bed of Ware measures approximately 10 feet square, large enough to sleep 12 or more people simultaneously, and was created as a showpiece for a Ware Inn, where it attracted visitors and was referenced in contemporary literature as a wonder of craftsmanship and scale. Shakespeare mentioned it. Ben Jonson mentioned it. It became, in the late 16th century, one of the famous sights of English inn culture. The Great Bed of Ware is the ultimate expression of the communal sleeping tradition, a piece of furniture so large that it could not possibly be for a single person or even a couple, but was explicitly designed for the group sleep that characterized medieval inn culture. Its creation at the very end of the 16th century, as the private bedroom and single-sleeper culture was beginning to develop among the better-off classes, makes it almost an act of nostalgia, a monumental celebration of the communal sleeping tradition at the moment of its decline. The elaborate carving of the great bed, the decorative panels, the carved posts, the painted surfaces also reflects the tradition of the bed as a status object, as a piece of furniture worthy of investment and display. This tradition, which we have traced back to the great medieval lord's canopied bed, was expressed in its most extreme form in the Great Bed of Ware, a piece of furniture so extraordinary that it achieved celebrity status in its own time. Pregnancy in the medieval world created specific modifications to the general sleeping patterns we have described, and the treatment of pregnant women's sleep reveals something about medieval attitudes toward pregnancy and the value placed on successful reproduction. Medieval medical advice for pregnant women included specific guidance on sleeping positions, sleeping duration, and the conditions of the sleeping space. The standard recommendation for sleeping position during pregnancy was relatively consistent with what modern obstetrics recommends, avoiding lying flat on the back in the later stages of pregnancy, favoring the left or right side. The reasoning differed from the modern, which focuses on vena cava compression, deriving instead from humeral theory, but the practical recommendation was similar. The duration of sleep recommended for pregnant women was generally generous by medieval standards. Medical texts recognized that pregnancy was a physically demanding state that required additional rest, and advice typically recommended more sleep than the normal pattern during the later stages of pregnancy. This is consistent with the modern recognition that fatigue is a normal feature of pregnancy, and that adequate rest supports healthy development. The social arrangements around pregnancy and sleep in wealthy households involved a specific period called the lying in, the weeks before and after childbirth, in which the pregnant or newly delivered woman was confined to a specially prepared chamber. This chamber was typically warmer than normal, better furnished, and more private than the general sleeping arrangements of the household. The lying-in chamber represented a temporary provision of the privacy and comfort that was otherwise unavailable even to wealthy medieval women. For ordinary women, the accommodations of pregnancy were whatever the household normally offered, without the special provisions available to the wealthy. The pregnant peasant woman slept on her usual pallet, in her usual communal arrangement, for as long as she was physically able and until shortly before delivery. The luxury of extended lying in was not available to women whose labor was essential to household survival. Medieval people were afraid of the night, and we have discussed the supernatural dimensions of that fear. But the medieval night also contained real, non-supernatural threats that justified genuine vigilance and shaped sleeping practices in concrete ways. Fire was the most catastrophic real threat to the sleeping medieval household. Medieval houses were built largely of wood and thatch, highly flammable materials that, once ignited, could be consumed in minutes. The fire that destroyed a medieval house typically started at night, when the household fire in the hearth was still banked and warm, when candles had been left burning, or when a sleeping person's bedding got too close to a heat source. The night fire that killed an entire family was not an unusual event in the medieval period. This genuine threat shaped sleeping practices in several ways. The strict rules about extinguishing candles before sleeping were not arbitrary, they were practical fire prevention. The coverage of the hearth fire with ashes before sleeping, the curfew, from the French couvre-feu or cover fire, was a standard practice specifically intended to reduce fire risk during the sleeping hours. The word curfew has survived in its modern sense, a time restriction on public activity, from the medieval practice of ringing the curfew bell to signal that fires should be banked for the night. Theft was another genuine night threat. Medieval houses, particularly in urban environments, were not secure by modern standards, and the burglar who entered through an unshuttered window or an insecure door while the household slept was a recognized danger. The medieval town burglar typically operated at night, specifically in the early morning hours when the first sleep would have given way to very deep second sleep, and the burglar's skills were somewhat adapted to the predictable two-sleep structure of the medieval night. The human predators of the medieval night, the thieves, the robbers, the bands of desperate men who operated in the darkness, were real and documented in court records, chronicles, and the literary tradition. The protective measures that medieval households took barred doors, dogs, proximity to neighbors, the positioning of the household's sleeping space away from vulnerable entry points, were responses to genuine threats rather than imagined ones. Cold was the quietest and most insidious of the genuine night threats. The person who went to sleep insufficiently warm and failed to maintain body temperature through the night, whether because of inadequate bedding, an extinguished fire, or illness, was at real risk of dying. Hypothermia was a regular cause of death in the medieval period, particularly among the elderly, the very young, and the very poor. The emphasis on warmth in medieval sleeping advice, the sharing of body heat, the careful banking of fires, all of these practices were responses to a genuine and potentially lethal threat. While this episode has focused primarily on the European medieval world, it is worth briefly acknowledging that sleep in the medieval Islamic world, in medieval China, and in medieval Japan had its own patterns and its own relationship to the biological reality of human sleep. The Islamic world of the medieval period, which we associate roughly with the period from the 7th to the 15th centuries, and the vast civilization stretching from Spain to Central Asia, had a sleep culture shaped by the specific requirements of Islamic religious practice. The 5 daily prayers, including Fajr dawn prayer and Isha night prayer, structured the Islamic day and night in a way that had some parallels to the canonical hours of Christianity. The Tahajjud, the voluntary night prayer specifically recommended in the Quran and Hadith as spiritually particularly valuable, was typically performed in the middle of the night, between the Isha prayer and the Fajr prayer. This practice aligns with the intersleep interval in a way that is strikingly similar to the Christian Matins office. It assumes a waking period in the middle of the night and gives that period specifically religious content. The Islamic recommendation to sleep after Isha, wake for Tahajjud, and then sleep again before Fajr is the two-sleep structure expressed in an Islamic religious framework. Medieval Chinese medical and philosophical texts also addressed sleep extensively. Chinese medicine had its own version of the observation that different times of night have different qualities, and that the body's internal processes during sleep vary across the night's hours. The concepts of yin and yang, and of the specific correspondences between time of day and organ function in traditional Chinese medicine, produced a Chinese version of the advice about optimal sleeping hours and positions that has some structural parallels to the European humoral tradition, even though the theoretical frameworks are entirely different. What is perhaps most striking, when you survey sleep practices across these different medieval cultures, is the convergence on similar practical insights despite completely different theoretical frameworks. The recommendation to sleep in 2 periods appears to follow from human biology rather than from any specific cultural tradition. The specific timing of the intersleep interval aligns with what modern sleep research identifies as a natural wake period in the sleep architecture of many people. The emphasis on appropriate temperature, on avoiding overstimulation before sleep, on the use of specific plants and substances. These appear across cultures because they reflect real observations about what supports human sleep. The cultural differences are real and significant. The specific prayers, the specific beliefs about dreams and their sources, the specific arrangements of sleeping space, the specific foods and medicines used. But beneath these cultural differences, the biological reality of human sleep imposed a common structure that medieval people across cultures identified and worked with in ways that, while different in their details, are recognizable as responses to the same underlying human experience. Before we conclude, let us take a moment to think about the sounds of the medieval night, the acoustic environment within which medieval sleep took place, because it was profoundly different from the sounds of any modern sleeping environment, and this difference is part of what made medieval sleep what it was. The medieval night was, in some ways, quieter than the modern night. There was no traffic noise, no internal combustion engines producing the constant background roar that modern urban dwellers are so habituated to that they no longer consciously notice it. There was no electrical hum, no aircraft overhead, no mechanical noise of any kind from the built infrastructure of the environment. but in other ways, the medieval night was noisier than the modern one. The sounds of animals were pervasive and immediate. Animals in the sleeping space itself, animals in adjacent stables, animals in the fields around the village. The sounds of other people were ever present in the communal sleeping arrangements. The sounds of the natural world, wind, rain, owls, the movement of trees, were more audible because they were not masked by the constant background noise of mechanical civilization. The church bell was the dominant artificial sound of the medieval night, and it was designed to be heard. Medieval church bells were large, loud instruments whose specific purpose was to be audible at considerable distances. In a quiet medieval countryside, the bell of a parish church was audible for miles. In a medieval town, multiple churches, each with their own bells, created a complex acoustic environment in which the canonical hours were announced by a chorus of overlapping bell sounds. The human sounds of the medieval night were also specific and recognizable. The night watchman's call, "All's well," or the time announcement, was a regular punctuation of the sleeping hours. The sounds of late-night travelers arriving at the inn, of guards making their rounds, of workers rising early for specific tasks. All of these created a soundscape that medieval sleepers were habituated to, and which, unlike our habituated response to traffic noise, was actually informationally useful. The sound of the night watchman calling the hours told you something important. The sound of unusual activity told you something potentially alarming. The sounds of the medieval night were, for those who knew how to hear them, a monitoring system for the welfare of the community. The practice of recording dreams, keeping what we might now call a dream journal, existed in the medieval world, though it was not a widespread popular practice in the way it became in the 20th century with the influence of psychoanalysis. Dream recording in the medieval period was primarily the province of people who believed their dreams were likely to carry significant messages. Holy men and women who expected divine communication through dreams, rulers and nobles who took prophetic dreams seriously as political intelligence, and scholars who were studying dreams as a theological or philosophical subject. The records that survive from medieval dream journals and chronicles are fascinating documents because they reveal the specific content that medieval people considered worth recording, and it was notably different from what a modern psychotherapist would look for. The focus was on symbolic imagery that might carry prophetic content. Animals, numbers, colors, specific figures from scripture or legend, the direction from which a vision appeared, whether it was accompanied by light or by fear. The emotional tone of the dream was less interesting to the medieval recorder than the specific symbolic content. The relationship between dream recording and the two-sleep structure is worth noting. The natural wake period between first and second sleep, when the mind was alert enough to hold and process the content of the first sleep's dreams before the second sleep began, was an ideal time for dream recording. A monk who woke for matins and then had an hour of quiet wakefulness before returning to sleep was in a position to reflect on and record the dreams of the first sleep while they were still fresh. This is, in fact, very close to what modern sleep researchers and therapists recommend. Recording dreams as soon as possible after waking, before the content fades, in a journal kept near the bed. The medieval monk with his candle and his writing materials, sitting in the quiet of the nighttime wake period to record what had appeared to him in the first sleep, was practicing something that modern sleep psychology independently recommends, for different reasons but with similar practical logic. The systematic nature of medieval dream interpretation, the use of organized reference texts, the consultation with learned authorities, the cross-referencing of dream content with established symbolic vocabularies, is also worth noting. The medieval person who dreamed of a specific animal or color, and then consulted a dream book to understand what this meant, was engaged in exactly the kind of reflective attention to dream content that modern depth psychology recommends, even though the theoretical framework was entirely different. What the medieval tradition lacked, by modern standards, was any skepticism about the external origin of dream content. The medieval dreamer assumed that significant dreams came from outside, from God, angels, or demons, rather than from the dreamer's own unconscious processes. This assumption shaped what was noticed and recorded, and it shaped the interpretive framework. But the practice of paying careful attention to dreams, recording them, and reflecting on their content was genuine and sustained, and it produced a large body of material that reveals much about medieval inner life. The evening hours before first sleep were, in the medieval household, a social occasion, one of the primary venues for the oral culture that was the main form of entertainment and cultural transmission in a world where literacy was limited and books were expensive. The telling of stories, the singing of songs, the playing of instruments if available, the recounting of news from the market or the road, all of these constituted the evening's entertainment, and they served as the transition between the active day and the first sleep. The social gathering by the fire before sleep was not unique to the medieval period. It is probably one of the oldest human social behaviors, a fire-centered evening gathering for warmth and companionship that extends back to the earliest human communities. But in the medieval world, it had specific forms and specific content. The professional storyteller, the jongleur in France, the spielman in Germany, the scop in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, was a recognized figure in the medieval entertainment world. These performers traveled between great houses and inns, offering their repertoire of songs, stories, and narratives to whatever audience would feed and house them. A good jongleur was a valued guest in a great house, and the performance offered before the household retired to sleep was a regular feature of aristocratic evening entertainment. For ordinary households without access to professional performers, the storytelling before sleep was done by whoever in the family or the neighborhood had the best repertoire and the most skill. The wise old woman who knew the local legends, the returned traveler who had stories from the road, the craftsman who had picked up a particular tale at the market. These informal performers filled the evening hours with narrative that was simultaneously entertainment, cultural transmission, and preparation for sleep. The content of medieval evening stories was not always calm or comfortable. Medieval narrative tradition embraced the terrible alongside the wonderful, stories of monsters, of terrible fates, of violent deaths and supernatural punishments were as much a part of the repertoire as stories of successful heroes and divine miracles. The tradition of bedtime stories that we have sanitized for modern children was, in the medieval world, a much rawer and more varied genre. The point was not to soothe, but to engage, to entertain, and to transmit the culture's understanding of the world, which included its understanding of danger and death as much as its understanding of hope and salvation. The effect of this evening narrative on the night's dreams was understood by medieval people, who believed that the images and stories occupying the mind before sleep would be processed and reflected in the dreams of the night. Medical and theological texts both advised against disturbing or frightening content immediately before sleep, on the grounds that it would produce disturbing dreams. The principle that what you think about before sleeping affects what you dream was well-established medieval knowledge. It is also, it turns out, well-established modern sleep science. As we approach the end of our exploration of medieval sleep, it is worth stepping back from the specific practices and considering what the medieval approach to sleep might offer to the modern person who is, in many cases, sleeping badly. The medieval period did not have our knowledge of sleep neuroscience, our understanding of circadian rhythms, our medications, or our cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. What it had was a long accumulated tradition of practical observation about what helped human beings sleep, organized within a theological and philosophical framework that gave sleep a significance beyond its immediate function. The specific practices worth considering are the possibility that sleeping in 2 periods rather than 1 might be more natural for some people than a single long block. The recognition that the wake period in the middle of the night is not a pathology to be corrected, but a natural interval that can be used productively for prayer, reflection, quiet conversation, or simply lying in the comfortable awareness of the night. The understanding that the transition to sleep benefits from preparation, ritual, prayer, calming activity, rather than an abrupt shift from stimulation to attempted unconsciousness. The medieval understanding that dreams are meaningful, and that spending time with them, recording them, reflecting on them, discussing them, is worthwhile, has been independently arrived at by modern psychology. The medieval practice of sleeping in physical proximity to other people, which seems strange from a modern individualist perspective, reflected a genuine social need that isolation may not serve well. The medieval relationship to darkness, treating it as significant and worthy of attention rather than simply as the absence of light, invited a quality of awareness in the sleeping hours that modern artificial lighting does not support. None of this is to say that medieval sleep was better than modern sleep across the board. It was often colder, less comfortable, more disrupted by external factors, and conducted under conditions of genuine physical hardship that we are well rid of. The point is not that the medieval was better, but that the specific structure and meaning of medieval sleep reflected some truths about human sleep that the modern framework has, in the rush to pathologize the middle-of-the-night wake and normalize the 8-hour block, somewhat lost sight of. The person lying awake at 3 in the morning, in the quiet of their own mind, has the same biology as the medieval monk waking for matins in the stone corridor of his monastery. They are doing the same thing their bodies were designed to do. The difference is only in the story they tell about it, whether they call it insomnia or the intersleep interval, whether they fight it with anxiety or receive it with the quiet attention of the canonical hour. That difference in the story told about an experience that is the same in both cases may matter more than any specific intervention or medication. The medieval sleeper had a story that made the middle-of-the-night wake natural and even meaningful. Modern insomnia sufferers often have a story that makes the same experience pathological and frightening. The biological reality is identical. The suffering differs. This is, perhaps, the deepest lesson that medieval sleep history has to offer, that the experience of being human in the dark hours of the night is the same experience it has always been, and that the most important variable is not the mattress or the medication, but the meaning. What you tell yourself the night is for. What you tell yourself your wakefulness means. Whether the dark and the quiet are enemies or companions. Medieval people, with all the hardships of their lives, often seem to experience the night as companion rather than enemy. They did not fight it. They did not demand that it conform to a prescribed 8-hour schedule. They lived within it, with their 2 sleeps and their midnight prayers and their dream interpretations, and their sleeping dogs and their church bells. The night was part of life, and they moved through it with a kind of practiced attentiveness that we have lost and might benefit from finding again. One of the more satisfying developments in the history of sleep research is the way that modern sleep science has, in the last few decades, begun to confirm what medieval people already knew from simple experience. The biological reality of the 2-sleep pattern was essentially hidden from sleep researchers for much of the 20th century, not because the evidence was difficult to find, but because the expectation of a single block sleep was so deeply embedded in the research framework that alternative patterns were not being looked for. The change began with Eckertsch's historical work in the early 2000s and was reinforced by the laboratory research of Thomas Weyer, a sleep researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, who conducted an experiment in the 1990s that effectively confirmed the biphasic sleep pattern as natural. Weyer's experiment involved removing artificial light from subjects' environments for extended periods, giving them 14 hours of darkness per night, and monitoring their sleep patterns. Without exception, his subjects reverted to a 2-sleep pattern within a few weeks. They fell asleep, slept for about 4 hours, woke for 1 to 3 hours, and then returned to sleep for another 4 hours. The intersleep interval was characterized by a specific brain state, elevated prolactin levels, a kind of calm meditative wakefulness. That is quite different from ordinary waking consciousness and quite different from insomnia. This finding was significant for multiple reasons. It confirmed that the historical evidence Eckerch had gathered was describing a real biological pattern rather than a cultural eccentricity. It suggested that the specific quality of the intersleep interval, the elevated prolactin, the calm wakefulness, might have had specific value. Prolactin is associated with feelings of quiescence and well-being, and the meditative quality of this interval that medieval people described might have been a genuine and distinctive feature of the experience. It also suggested that current insomnia, which is epidemic in modern Western societies, may be in significant part the result of the mismatch between biological sleep architecture and the social expectation of a single unbroken sleep block. If the body wants to sleep in 2 periods and is forced by social convention to try to sleep in 1, the result is a population that spends a significant portion of its sleeping hours awake in the middle of the night, experiences this wakefulness as a failure, and enters into the anxiety-arousal cycle that is the hallmark of clinical insomnia. The medieval person who woke at midnight was not in an anxiety-arousal cycle. They were in an elevated prolactin meditative state, which they used for prayer or quiet reflection or conversation, and which they then exited naturally into their second sleep. The same biological event, experienced within completely different cultural frameworks, produced completely different outcomes. This is a lesson in the power of the stories we tell about our experiences to shape those experiences in fundamental ways. Since we have now spent several hours establishing that medieval sleep was different, and that some of those differences may have been advantages, it is only fair to offer some practical reflection on what, if anything, this history suggests you might try. None of the following requires abandoning modern life or pretending you live in the 12th century. They are simply observations from the medieval sleep tradition that have some support from modern sleep research, and that require no significant change in living circumstances to attempt. First, if you wake in the middle of the night and cannot immediately return to sleep, try not treating this as a failure. The medieval approach was to accept the waking as natural, use the time for some quiet and undemanding activity, prayer, reflection, very quiet reading, and allow the return to sleep to happen when the body was ready. Anxiety about being awake makes being awake worse. The medieval tradition had no concept of insomnia as a pathology, and that conceptual absence may have been one of its greatest practical gifts. Second, the transition from evening to sleep benefits from deliberate marking. The medieval household's evening rituals, the bedtime prayers, the banking of the fire, the specific preparations for sleep, were not superstition. They were a physiological transition that signaled to the body and mind that the day was over, and a different mode of being was beginning. The modern equivalent might be a consistent bedtime routine, the dimming of lights, the cessation of stimulating activity. Not because any of these things are inherently magical, but because the signal function is real and the body responds to consistent cues. Third, the completeness of medieval darkness during sleep was a genuine advantage. The human sleep system is regulated by light in ways that make the blue spectrum light of screens and most artificial lighting actively disruptive. Medieval sleepers did not have to manage this problem. Modern sleepers who find their sleep disrupted might experiment with making their sleeping environment significantly darker than the modern default. Fourth, the communal nature of medieval sleep suggests that the isolation of the modern private bedroom may not suit all people equally well. Some people sleep better in the presence of others. The sound of another person's breathing, the warmth of physical proximity, the implicit security of not being alone, these may be genuine sleep aids for some individuals that our culture currently pathologizes as adult neediness or poor boundaries. The medieval tradition knew that human beings were social animals in sleep, as in everything else, and arranged accordingly. These are small suggestions, not prescriptions. The medieval night was full of hardships that we are better off without, and the improvements in sleeping conditions that modern life offers are genuine and significant. But within those modern conditions, there may be room to reclaim some of what the medieval relationship to sleep understood and expressed. The naturalness of waking in the night, the value of the transition ritual, the importance of darkness, and the fundamental human social nature that persists even in the sleeping hours. Every household that slept with some degree of comfort in the medieval world depended on people whose job it was to make that sleep possible. And those people are almost entirely invisible in the historical record. The servant who banked the fire before the household retired. The groom who checked the stables to ensure the animals were settled and no danger of fire existed. The cook who had prepared the evening meal so that the household could sleep without hunger. The nurse who attended to children through the night so that parents could rest. The household steward who checked the locks and the doors before lying down himself. These were the backstage workers of medieval sleep, and the invisibility that characterizes most domestic labor in the historical record applies to them fully. We know they existed because the households they served could not have functioned without them. We know their tasks because household ordinances and domestic management texts describe what needed to be done. But their individual names, their own sleep arrangements, their experience of performing nighttime duties while their employers slept, these are largely lost. The distribution of nighttime labor in the medieval household was deeply unequal, in ways that followed the general structure of medieval inequality. The wealthy slept undisturbed through the night because others did not. The more senior the household member, the more thoroughly their sleep was protected by the labor of those below them. The great lord's sleep was virtually sacrosanct. He was disturbed only by genuine emergencies, and multiple layers of household staff stood between him and any ordinary nighttime disturbance. The lowest household servant's sleep was interrupted freely, and without ceremony whenever there was something that needed doing. This inequality of sleep, the way that the right to uninterrupted sleep was distributed according to power and status, is a feature of human social organization that extends well beyond the medieval period. It persists in recognizable forms today, in the sleep patterns of parents versus non-parents, of on-call medical workers versus their daytime colleagues, of workers in shift economies versus those in regular employment. The medieval version was starker and more openly acknowledged as a function of hierarchy, but the underlying dynamic is continuous. The recognition of this inequality is, perhaps, one more gift that the medieval sleep history gives to the modern reader. A reminder that the sleep that one person gets is often purchased at the cost of someone else's sleeplessness, and that the full accounting of who sleeps and who does not in any society reveals the distribution of power and burden as clearly as any other indicator. Before we close, let us spend just a moment with the practical question that this entire episode has been building toward. What does any of this mean for how you, right now, in the 21st century, might approach the experience of sleep? The honest answer is that medieval history does not provide a blueprint. You cannot simply adopt the two-sleep pattern by decision. Your schedule, your obligations, your living situation, and the structure of the world around you constrain what is possible. You cannot eliminate artificial light from your life, move your sleeping space to a warmer communal room, or arrange for a church bell to mark your midnight waking. The medieval conditions that produced medieval sleep patterns are gone, and they are gone for good reasons. But medieval history does provide a perspective. It demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that the sleep pattern that modern medicine considers normal, the single unbroken block of 8 hours, is a historical novelty rather than a biological absolute. It demonstrates that human beings have slept in a wide variety of patterns, across an enormous range of conditions, and that what constitutes normal sleep is considerably more flexible than modern sleep medicine sometimes implies. It demonstrates that the middle-of-the-night waking that modern culture calls insomnia was, for most of human history, considered a natural and even valuable feature of the night rather than a pathological failure. Most of all, it demonstrates that sleep is not just a biological process but a cultural practice, one that is embedded in a web of meanings, relationships, rituals, and stories that shape the experience as much as the neurology does. Medieval sleep worked for medieval people, partly because the cultural framework within which it occurred made sense of it and gave it meaning. The two-sleep structure was not just tolerated, it was theologically significant. The communal bed was not just accepted, it was socially appropriate. The darkness was not just endured, it was spiritually inhabited. We have changed the conditions. We have, in many cases, not replaced the meaning. And that absence of meaning, the modern experience of sleep as a purely biological necessity to be optimized and managed, rather than a significant human experience to be engaged with, may be part of what makes modern sleep so difficult for so many people. So there it is, the medieval approach to sleep, in all its strange and illuminating detail. The two sleeps that nobody told us about. The communal bed that was simply how things worked. The animals sharing the sleeping space with pragmatic inevitability. The church bells marking the hours of the night with a public timekeeping that modern life has no equivalent for. The darkness, genuine, complete darkness, that gave the medieval night a texture and a weight that our light-saturated world cannot replicate. The dreams that were taken seriously as messages from beyond. The prayers that transformed the act of lying down into a spiritual preparation. The bodily temperature calculations that made sharing a bed with a stranger a simple matter of survival mathematics. We have covered tonight the full sweep of medieval sleep, from the biology of biphasic sleep that organized every medieval night into two distinct periods, to the communal beds of inns where strangers of different nationalities and social classes lay down together as a matter of course, to the animals that kept medieval families warm in their winter sleeping quarters, to the elaborate cosmology of demons and protective prayers that made the act of going to sleep a spiritually significant event. We have been to the monasteries, where the canonical hours structured the night with a precision that still influences our language and our sense of what night is for. We have been to the battlefield camps, where exhausted soldiers slept on hard ground in rotations that made any sleep a luxury. We have been to the pilgrim hospitals, where the sick and the well and the people from every corner of Christendom lay down together in the democratic equality of exhaustion. We have been to the great beds of medieval lords and the straw pallets of their tenants, and we have seen how the same biological pattern played out across all of that enormous range of material conditions. We have talked about the mare, the night creature that sat on sleepers' chests, and that medieval people took with complete seriousness as an explanation for what modern neurology calls sleep paralysis. We have talked about dream interpretation and the serious scholarly tradition that treated dreams as diagnostically and prophetically significant. We have talked about lullabies, about storytelling before sleep, about the soporific herbs that medieval apothecaries prepared with care and genuine pharmacological knowledge. We have talked about what medieval people wore to bed and what they didn't, and why the distinction was more a function of temperature and economics than of modesty. And we have talked at the end about what all of this might mean for modern sleep, the people lying awake right now, at whatever hour this is reaching you, in a world that has changed everything about the physical conditions of sleep while leaving the biology exactly where it was 10 centuries ago. What is perhaps most striking, when you look at all of this together, is not how foreign medieval sleep was, but how human it was. The two-sleep structure was aligned with biology rather than fighting it. The communal sleeping arrangements acknowledged the social nature of human beings rather than insisting on an isolation that our evolution has not prepared us for. The relationship to darkness was serious and thoughtful rather than either panicked or dismissive. The spiritual framework gave sleep a meaning that transcended mere physical restoration. The medieval person who lay down to sleep each evening was performing an act embedded in a web of community, theology, and biological reality. They were not alone, there were other warm bodies nearby, which was both practically important for temperature and psychologically meaningful in terms of safety. They were not silent, the sounds of the community, the breathing of bedfellows, The distant bells all connected them to the world outside. They were not without purpose. The sleep they were entering was theologically significant. The dreams they might have were potentially meaningful, and the prayers they had said before lying down had invested the experience with spiritual content. They were, in short, completely at home in the night, in a way that many modern people are not. That sense of being at home in the night, of belonging to the darkness as much as to the light, of having a legitimate and dignified place in the sleeping hours, is perhaps the thing that the medieval tradition has most completely to offer to the modern sleeper who lies awake at 3 in the morning feeling like a failure. You belong here. The night has room for you. Your wakefulness is not a malfunction. It is, in the most fundamental biological sense, exactly what you were designed for. We have built a world of artificial light and personal privacy, and 8-hour sleep targets and insomnia diagnoses that may, in some significant respects, be fighting the way human bodies and minds actually work. Medieval people did not have better sleep science than we do. The humoral theory was wrong, the demon fears were unfounded, and some of the specific recommendations were useless or harmful. But they were working with a sleep pattern that aligned with human biology, and they were embedded in social and spiritual structures that gave their nightly vulnerability a context and a meaning. The historian looking at medieval sleep is not looking at a primitive or inadequate version of what we now do correctly. They are looking at a different solution to a permanent problem. How does a human being navigate the hours of unconsciousness that the body requires, in a world that is simultaneously dangerous and beautiful and full of other people who also need to sleep? The medieval solution involved bells and prayers and straw and dogs, and 2 sleeps and communal warmth, and the interpretation of dreams. Our solution involves melatonin supplements and white noise machines and sleep tracking apps and blackout curtains, and the persistent, nagging sense that we are doing it wrong. It is not obvious that our solution is better. It is newer. It has different advantages and different disadvantages. And understanding the medieval solution, in all its strangeness and its wisdom, is one of the ways that we can begin to see our own solution clearly enough to improve it. If you are awake right now, at some hour that modern convention has declared should be sleep time, listening to this and finding that your sleep is not cooperating, consider the possibility that your body is not broken. Consider the possibility that it is simply trying to do something that it has done for thousands of years, and that the framework you are operating in is the thing that has changed. Your ancestors woke at midnight and lay quietly in the dark, or prayed, or talked softly to the person beside them, and then went back to sleep when their body was ready. They did not have the concept of insomnia as a pathology, because they did not have the expectation of a single unbroken sleep that insomnia is the failure to achieve. Perhaps just for tonight, you could adopt the medieval approach. You are not insomniac. You are not broken. You are awake in your natural intersleep interval, in a tradition that stretches back further than recorded history. Rest. The second sleep will come. The medieval person lying in the quiet dark of their intersleep interval was not suffering from a sleep disorder. They were in a mildly elevated prolactin state, physiologically calm, temporarily freed from the demands of daylight rationality, in the hour that their culture had set aside for prayer and reflection. They were doing, in other words, something that their biology had designed them to do, and something that their culture had given them the conceptual tools to experience as meaningful rather than threatening. You are in the same biology. You are in the same dark hours. What differs is only the story. And stories, as medieval people understood deeply, and we have somewhat forgotten, are not merely decorations on top of experience. They are the structure within which experience becomes possible. The story that the middle of the night wake is insomnia produces insomnia. The story that it is the natural interval between 2 sleeps produces something quite different. Medieval people told themselves a story about the night that made them capable of navigating it. We could perhaps afford to borrow some of that story, even if we cannot borrow the conditions. The dark is not against you. The waking is not a failure. You are right now, exactly where your ancestors have been for every night of human history before the industrial world came along and decided to optimize everything. Lie still. The second sleep will come. It always has. Good night. Thank you for spending this evening, or these small hours, with boring history for sleep. If you have learned something about medieval sleep habits and found it either useful or genuinely soporific, then we have achieved our goal. We have traveled a considerable distance tonight, from the basic biology of biphasic sleep through the communal beds and shared warmth of medieval households, through the canonical hours of the monastery and the superstitions of the farm, through the Mara sitting on the chest of the sleeper, and the physician prescribing herbal preparations for the insomniac, through the prayers of the household before first sleep and the quiet reflection of the intersleep interval. It has been a thorough tour of the medieval night, and we hope it has been as educational as it has been restful. The thing that strikes us most in the end is how much care medieval people gave to sleep, how seriously they took the preparation for it, the experience of it, the interpretation of what happened during it, and the proper conduct of the waking hours within it. Sleep was not something they did between the important parts of life. It was one of the important parts, with its own theology, its own medicine, its own social arrangements, and its own relationship to the cosmos. We have perhaps lost that seriousness in the modern world. We have better mattresses, better climate control, better understanding of sleep neuroscience, and far more people diagnosed with sleep disorders than ever existed in the medieval period. The connection between these things, between the improvement in physical conditions and the degradation of the experience, is worth sitting with. Perhaps what the medieval world had that we lack is not better technology or better conditions, but better orientation. They knew what the night was for. They had a framework, religious, biological, social, that gave the sleeping hours a shape and a meaning that transcended the merely functional. They did not merely pass out from exhaustion at the end of the day and hope for the best. They prepared, they prayed, they arranged themselves in their households, and they moved into the night as a known territory with its own rules and its own gifts. That is, perhaps, a practice worth recovering in whatever form makes sense within modern life. Not the straw mattress, not the demon fears, not the communal sleeping hall with 12 strangers, but the orientation, the sense that the night is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a part of life to be inhabited. The understanding that waking in the middle of the night is not a failure, but a feature. The willingness to receive the dark hours with something other than anxiety. Next week we will be back with more history, more of the surprising, detailed, genuinely strange stories that reveal the past as a place that was fully inhabited by fully human people. Topics coming include why you would not have lasted a day in ancient Greece, what it was really like to eat in ancient Rome, and the surprisingly bizarre social rules of medieval courtship. All of it designed to educate, to interest, and to provide exactly the gentle mental occupation that encourages the second sleep to come. Until then, settle yourself. Breathe slowly. If you wake in the small hours, do not be alarmed. Your biology is working exactly as it was designed to work, as it has worked for every human being who has ever lived through the night. The same biology that woke the medieval monk for matins, that stirred the peasant beside his banked fire to turn over and listen to the silence, that nudged the pilgrim awake in the dormitory of the Pilgrim Hospital to lie for a quiet hour in the anonymous company of 100 strangers. That biology is yours. It has not changed. Only the story around it has changed, and stories can be changed back. You belong in the night. The night has made room for you since the first human beings looked up at the stars above their fire and felt, alongside whatever fears the darkness held, the ancient and biological comfort of being a living creature in the world. That comfort is still available. It requires only that you stop fighting the night and start inhabiting it. The darkness is not your enemy. The waking is not your failure. The quiet of the small hours is not a problem to be solved. It is a space that human beings have been moving through, thoughtfully and prayerfully and pragmatically, for as long as there have been human beings to move through it. You are in very good company, even in the silence. The whole long past of your species is right here with you, navigating the same dark, waiting for the same second sleep.